And so we return and begin again. Welcome to the Invisible Podcast, issuesode 5. It's not invisible and it's not really a podcast. But you should hopefully know the idea by now. I'm Bobsy and we are going issue by issue, page by page, panel by panel, and theory by theory through the cosmic conspiracy classic, The Invisibles by Grant Morrison and co. It helps us understand our brains in the 90s. That's kind of why we're doing it. We're on issue 5. Look, double spread cover. It says a few things, this cover. Okay, so first of all, this was a variant cover, very popular in the 90s. It's a way of artificially juicing sales a little bit. So there are many like this, but this one is mine. That means there are this kind of like, they use the word, I think, like, was it distressed? It's not distressed. It's de-enhanced. So in the 90s, comics were hitting one of their periodic sales slumps. Like, periodic is another word for constant in this kind of context, really. You put out a load of different covers for the same comic so that people who like the comic will buy more than one copy. Yeah, it's that simple. You do it to juice sales, but it also kind of is something when, so the sales aren't as good as you want, and yet there's still some like editorial faith and, more importantly, budget behind the comic to spend the money in the first place, that outlay, on doing a bunch of different covers that you're going to publish for the comic. Okay, so this one is mine, but there are lots like this. So there's like 5 different versions of this cover going around. Mine says, "You are now leaving the 20th century" on it, which means various things. It's got these interesting little icons on there, which are it's brilliantly designed. It's Ryan Hughes again. These icons kind of were the kind of thing which would come into prominence on digital platforms much later. There's a really nice, it's de-enhanced, yeah, that's the word they've used. So kind of usually you would have extra colours or kind of special dot printing kind of thing to a bit of embossing, maybe some lenticular holographic kind of stuff. But here they've kind of gone for the opposite. They've taken some of the production values, taken some of the colour anyway, out of the process, and what they've done is actually turn in a comic book cover which is quite unique, except for the fact, unique insofar as there are 5 of them, really nicely designed, pretty damn stylish, but more importantly, resilient as hell. This is by far the tightest cover. This is by far the best survivor of the 25 years since it was originally bought, of any of the Invisibles issues that we've covered so far. So this says, the stock's nice and thick. This was expensive. Somebody had some faith in this comic, because even 5 issues in, the sales aren't great. So it's obviously suffering enough that it needs to have, a little bit of an extra promotional push, even at this relatively quite early stage. But somebody bothered to do it. They didn't just cancel it. They were like, no, we're going to do this. Somebody had some faith in the project, somebody beyond the obvious contenders like Grant Morrison, right? Okay, who's gone to some lengths in the back of the comic to say how important this book is to him. So what's on the cover? You are now leaving the 20th century. Time machines, okay? The obvious thing here is that, like, this story that we're going to deal with, this is Arcadia, part 1. Arcadia is the next story, like the first proper arc after the intro arc that we've just done, the first issue and then the 3 follow-up issues. That takes us into the first third of the year, and now it's kind of getting into its stride. That stride is a little bit less kind of like athletic and dynamic than you might think on the strength of this issue, but we'll get to those kind of like arguments about quality and appropriate tone and what you kind of expect from a young adult kind of adventure comic, which this kind of isn't. Spoilers, this is the best issue yet. It's fabulous. We really like it. What's on the cover, though? You are now leaving the 20th century. We've got these arrows. So, we've got these red and black contrast. Red for communism, black for anarchism. And what else? Okay, so you've got this other colour here, right? And there are these kind of straight lines. I'm not quite sure whether it works better if you hold it that way or that way, or that way. But the these angles and these squares and these verticals and these horizontals, maybe a guillotine, maybe a forest, maybe a windmill. Really difficult to tell. So there may not, obviously there probably isn't something hidden in this design, although maybe there is. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what the kind of the concept is beyond, like, you can't tell, which is probably the concept. But there's something very appealing about it. It's actually really cool, and I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's actually really cool. On the back, you've got the words "Crash the Bus." Buses in this kind of like late 20th century countercultural context are certainly, with the kind of acid head stuff that we're going to get to in this story arc, refers to Ken Kesey's school bus, probably. This is a motif that Morrison had used before in the Doom Patrol. We're talking about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, a guy like a kind of a CIA brainwashy kind of guy as far as the latter-day conspiracy lore goes, who was given a ton of free acid by someone and got a bus and drove it around America, giving the kids acid, or at least drove around sort of the cool bits of America, California, or whatever. And he hooked up with Neil Cassidy, who was kind of from this is in what, 66, 67, from like a decades earlier kind of like angel-headed hipster types. Neil Cassidy was obviously the inspiration for I'm going to forget his name. It's not important. But like he's like the other guy who Jack Kerouac goes around America with in On the Road. Kerouac's kind of beat literature classic. So that's what the bus means. Like, it's about kind of getting out there, injecting a slice of weirdness into middle America, or like normie culture, and giving them all just loads of acid and fucking their heads up. And that's fine. Why not? Okay, good times. But then you crash the bus. Something which Cassidy, for all of his, literally, he was the driver, right? He used to drive the bus. He would, there's loads of film of him doing this, like literally walk away from the steering wheel and just allow the bus to kind of like go on and drive itself, sort of thing. They were all fabulously off their nuts at the time, and that's fine. And the bus didn't crash, but the bus can crash, obviously, and this is kind of almost exhorting one to do so. This is saying that the bus wants to be crashed, that you want the bus to be crashed, even though the bus is in some way this kind of like mobile microcosm of cultural utopia, but we want it, but someone's telling us to crash it. So this is all quite a lot. So this is obviously a double spread cover. It's a different type of paper, really a bit nice and thick and rough, but it carries on the inside. Oh yeah, sorry. So these lines here, forest guillotines is what we're thinking. I'm thinking guillotines. Something about the way the arrows are pointing down, the way you've got quite a sharp line there. I'm thinking that this might be a guillotine that we can't quite see yet. You'll know why later. There's guillotines later. On the inside, though, this kind of adds fuel to the fire. That there's a bit of a commercial imperative here, and maybe some kind of trepidation editorially around what's going on in this issue. That this comic book, even though it's only 5 issues and really did need like a relaunch, like a soft relaunch, to bring in, obviously, not only is this about getting the fans to buy more than one copy, this book stands out on the shelves. Even though it stands out in a kind of a lo-fi way, it doesn't look like any other comic that you can buy still. And therefore, presumably some other people who wouldn't have bought it previously would have been tempted to pick it up. And then when you get inside the inside front cover, rather than having an advert, don't worry, it's not an ads-free issue. There are going to be adverts that we can talk about later. We've got like a huge recap of the previous 4 issues, and it's not even just a recap. It's actually giving us lots of lots of like original information, loads of stuff that we didn't know before. But because we're using these physical issues as the basis of these objects as the basis of the narrative that we are exploring, this is all fair game. Once we've read this inside cover, we know more about the rest of the comic and the story and what's going on. So therefore, we're allowed to use it. I said, and I've said it several times now, even though we're only 5 minutes in, somebody had some faith in this comic. If you turn the cover, You might know who they are. I'm going to hold it up. I don't know if I'm brave enough to say the word out loud, but I'm going to hold it up to the camera and hope that you can see it there. The word, I don't know whether that's come through or come out reversed or whatever, but the word is Illuminati. Now, even though, kind of way back in our first episode, I sort of spotted quite an obvious, blatant, like Illuminati-esque reference in it. This is actually the first time it's been mentioned. It's a bit like, we've got 5 issues in, cards on the table, as much as, these guys are going to put their cards on the table. It's about the Illuminati. Okay, let's go. So, the Invisibles, right? An organisation. This is a handy recap for new jumping on viewers of the Invisible podcast. Great to have you. I'm sure none of you exist, but let's go for it like this, right? We're going to have a little recap of what the comic's about. The Invisibles. An organisation dedicated to subversive activity in all its forms. It has been implicated in everything from the French and American revolutions to strange graffiti on toilet walls. Well, I've read all the issues so far, and this is news to me. I didn't know that. It may be connected to the fabled Illuminati. Etc. Yeah, you've seen, the Illuminati, they're in the hip-hop videos. It may not even exist in anything but conceptual terms, but all of its members know that they belong to it in its ranks, even if they have never met any other Invisibles. The only rule of the organisation is disobedience. That's what I've got on my new sticker. Okay, King Mob. Master assassin and leader of an activist cell of Invisibles operatives, he has just concluded the recruitment of his newest member, Dane McGowan. That's what our last 4 issues have been about. A surly adolescent outsider with a grudge against authority. Dane, now known as Jack Frost, makes a bizarre addition to a group whose ranks include Boy, a street girl from New York City, Ragged Robin, a witch whose abilities are fueled by disbelief, and Lord Fanny, a glamorous transvestite shaman. So this is nice. Like, we know a bit more about the people in the comic, the people who've been following Jack around for the past 5 issues, just from that quick paragraph. There's a lot of information in there compared to what we've had so far. Because of the kind of, the kind of deliberately oblique sort of storytelling that the comic employs. Interesting stuff in there. Transvestite shamanism. Lord Fanny is a transvestite shaman. I don't think we'd say that anymore. We will definitely get to that further down the line in later issues. Ragged Robin is a witch whose abilities are fueled by disbelief. That's been alluded to before, but having it there in brown and brown is useful. King Mob, we know. Boy is a street girl from New York City. We didn't know that. We just knew that she was a black woman. That was it. But she's not a black woman. She's a street girl. The word street kind of is doing a lot of work here. Okay. Okay, then in our next bit, Orlando, who we met at the end of the last issue, remember? It's not quite clear. The storytelling is a bit muddy, so it's not quite clear whether he is like in number 10 or just on the phone to somebody in number 10 Downing Street. Whether he's kind of like been to a 10-hour blood-fueled cabinet orgy or is talking to somebody who's doing that. It's not quite clear, but we did meet Orlando at the end of the last episode, and he was scary. He's a vicious killer. His next target is King Mob's invisible cell. That's our buddies. And even though their new mission will take them through time and space, they may still be close enough for Orlando to grasp. Their new mission will take them through time and space. That's exciting. Maybe that's got something to do with the "you are now leaving the 20th century" thing we just saw on the front cover. But also, like, it was 1995, yeah? Historical context. I mean, maybe it's not obvious, but it's quite important. Everybody was going mad and thought the world was going to end. They didn't really think the world was going to end. They just wanted it and knew that pretending that the world was going to end was great for kicks. Like, it gives you all kinds of excuse for all kinds of licentious behaviour, and that was what we wanted in the 1990s. I've spoken in previous episodes about how certain economic kind of like lineups and the kind of the global political sphere, cheap credit and no kind of obvious nuclear destruction on the horizon meant that people were having a good time in the 90s, basically, and like kind of hedonism, but not a terribly exciting hedonism. A kind of a boozy, backward-looking hedonism was like very much one of the cultural. It wasn't just boozy, but it was kind of like that was like very much in the zeitgeist. Okay. Then this is radical, guys. There's a little review, or an excerpt from a review here from Spin. I don't remember Spin being a British music paper, so I'm going to say that it's like an American one. It's like a little review of a of the previous issues of the comic from the magazine Spin. Now, comics didn't get reviewed in the mainstream press. The fact that they've got this in here is worth shouting about. And, even though sales aren't looking good, and like we don't know this yet, but you know that sales aren't looking good at this point, the critical reception has been very, very warm. And the people who read the comic and liked it, like myself, became quite fanatical about it quite quickly. So this review reads, the great thing about comics is that, and this is true, the great thing about comics is that young upstarts regularly pop up to toss the whole greasy mess, quite like the way that these phrase that, in the air and remind a new generation of readers that you should never underestimate the profundity of a trash medium. Listen to podcasts, kids, they're good for you. Scottish writer Grant Morrison is the latest such anarchist. Morrison's imaginary landscapes encourage open-ended metaphysical play. One issue's pagan follies, the best follies, set the stage for Byron and Shelley debating utopia in the next. Basically, it's about everything. Spin magazine. Pagan follies in the previous episode? Maybe the reviewer got it wrong. Maybe he was just making stuff up. Okay. And then it says, and then it refers a bit back to what iconography, it kind of gives us our kind of like punchy, advertorial, adversarial rhetoric that we've been getting used to as we've been going along. There's this big kind of like revolutionary statement. Are you ready to wear the black badge? Read on. We're being recruited into the Invisibles by doing this. Whew, okay, so that was just the first two. That's we've done the outside cover, so we won't be doing the back cover later, and the inside front cover. We know we've got the Illuminati, we've got disobedience, we've got the French and American revolutions, we've got toilet walls, we've got King Mob and his dudes. King Mob is like the star, like the headline character here, not Dane, who's the character we've been with the whole time. Orlando, who we kind of only saw briefly last time, as being really heavily set up. We've got this thing where it's like, this isn't just a comic, this is a comic that people who don't like comics like, which is incredibly important for kind of the way that the entire object wishes to position itself. And then we've got a bit of like rousing rhetoric at the end. And that's all before we've even started the comic. Welcome. And then we go to page 1. Okay, how do we start talking about this? So this, so the whole Arcadia thing, the whole of this issue and the next 3, it's a 4-issue arc, go quite deep into like what the Invisibles are all about, what the kind of the world view of the Invisibles and the as in like the characters in the comic itself, the people creating the comic and the people reading the comic, kind of how those differing but not differing very much perspectives kind of overlap and play and say things about who we are and the world that we live in. This starts as okay, so page 1, King Mob, who we know him from the inside front cover, even if we hadn't read the previous issues. He's gap yearing it right up. He is in Indonesia, and he is watching, what are they called? It's like, oh my goodness, I did write it down because I knew that I would forget. It is at a, oh no, those are last issue. Oh, what a professional. Those are last issue's notes, reader. God, what's it called? Wayang. Thank you. Sorry, Wayang. So this form of shadow puppetry that's Indonesian and kind of like a very old sort of like Indonesian folk tradition is called Wayang. Sorry, I'm really sorry that I got that wrong. I should have turned to my notes earlier. Please still subscribe, please. So King Mob is watching this Wayang play, shadow puppetry, very kind of common. You've seen it on telly. Very interesting, intricate, complex, very sort of like what's the word I'm looking for? Very like structured and traditional and kind of intricate. Like there's a whole kind of like layer of Indonesian culture and society, which is kind of about doing this. Like the closest we've got is like Punch and Judy or something like that, because it's like the art of being a Punch and Judy man is like passed down from generation to generation. There's almost like an entire like professional cast of people who do Wayang shadow puppetry, because it's like super important to how the culture kind of like understands itself. It's like their favorite. It's like their favorite art form. Like when you've got like 20,000 years or whatever of humans sitting around waiting for the telly to be invented, they come up with stuff like this, like wayang, like beautifully intricate and choreographed and kind of like folk, like in a folk structure. So like oral stories being told and retold, with music which is kind of like weaves in and out of it, kind of like actually within the plays themselves, but also within the history of the form. You get wonderful kind of like complex, rich cultural artifacts like wayang and like the dalang, right? Okay, so this is your metaphor for the start of the issue. There's a lot of metaphors in this issue. It's maybe a little bit A-level, maybe a little bit undergrad, some of the stuff that we're going to be going into here. I really apologise for that. I don't apologise for it. It's fine. It's still smart stuff. It's just a lot of it feeds very neatly into some sort of fairly rigid and well-trodden categories that we have for thinking about some of these things. I'm going to tread right into some of these paths, and I apologise for not having a 10,000 interesting and original new thoughts page. Unlike the comic, which has a couple. He's watching. So the Delang, right? He's the guy from this professional cast. He's the shadow puppet master. Let's be honest. He's basically Grant Morrison within the metaphor, right? He's the guy whose skill makes us believe that we see a war between two great armies, but there is no war. There is only the Delang. So there's either somebody in the comic who is pulling all these strings and making these shadow puppets who look like they are real things dance and in a great war, but really it's Morrison who's kind of talking about the artistic process here himself, and also if you take another bigger step back, it's about the forces of whatever that might have their hand on Morrison's shoulder. Then if you kind of take the step inwards into the universe of the comic, it's about thinking about somebody in the plot, in the comic itself, who maybe is pulling some strings, who maybe isn't what he seems, who's maybe making us believe things that aren't what they're saying they are. We know this because this is the work of the Dalang puppeteer. Very clever man, very skilled. He makes the voices and moves the puppets. The Dalang is more than a puppeteer, right? His job is to make us laugh and cry. Very clever man. He's kind of like the shadow puppets have got their own like types of, they've got their own body language, they've got their own way of moving, they've got their own types of expression. Like the whole point is that you can make these very simple cut out bits of paper puppets have like a life which absolutely transports and captivates and transports probably the audience, makes them believe that a real thing is happening here. The thing that they're watching is an excerpt from the Mahabharata, the ancient Hindu myth cycle, the fifth Veda. More specifically, the Bhagavadgita, like a bit for like the Mahabharata is like ridiculously long and old. The Bhagavadgita is like the bit in the middle of it. God, how do you start talking about this? It's well complex. So we're introduced to we've met this guy here. We've got this guy here, right? He's a buddy of King. This is King Mob. We've got this guy here who's a buddy of King Mob and who is giving us this narration at the start of this episode. He talks about Arjuna, a prince of the Pandava brothers. And Krishna, an incarnation of Lord Vishnu, is his charioteer. And here the other. So this is the first guy that we get, Arjuna. This is Arjuna here again. And then this guy we get. Here is Duryodhana, an enemy of Arjuna. And the Mahabharata is the story of a big fight, great war between two armies that we just had, between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. So, Arjuna is the Pandava, Duryodhana is the Kaurava. Arjuna is kind of like the silver. He's like the alpha hero of this story, right? He's like the kind of the golden boy. He's thought of as silver. Like traditionally rather than golden, but you know what I mean, he's the golden boy. He's like the kind of the crown prince. He's like the sexy new thing of the Arjuna dynasty, who are kind of like, they may be like they're kind of like the best royal family in this ancient kind of like, how old, we don't know. The brilliant thing about the Mahabharata is that it's probably around 5,000 years old. It's easily very, very, very old, drawing on oral traditions, which maybe go back to, like before the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, and, and depending how far you go into these conspiracy theories, like way, way back to the very, very first human. And when I say human, I don't really mean human. I mean kind of like better than human, superhuman, god human, initial inhabitants of the planet Earth, right? The kind of like the Space Brothers, basically the aliens. They've got the flying saucers, they've got the awesome arrows, they've got all the funky stuff that anyone who's seen the Ancient Aliens TV show knows about. That these myths talk about magic powers in a way which to us as 20th century people growing up on UFO lore think, hang on a minute, this looks like all of our like myth looks like so much like sci-fi. Maybe it was sci-fi. Maybe it was aliens, right? Maybe it was people with actual laser guns and UFOs. And this is like, and the Mahabharata, the Gita, it lends itself to that reading very well, but kind of like it's about as old and rad a sci-fi story as you're going to get. That's kind of why it's here, other than the fact that the Lang and the Wei Yang metaphor fits in really nicely to what we're talking about. The fact there's a big battle between two different types of army. There's the bit we were talking about in the last episode about how human beings, and that I mentioned just now, about how human beings may not be really what's going on here, right? That we might be vessels or chariots for kind of like praetor historical forces which are running the show. So so not just the people in the comic, but us are being not manipulated, but we're just the channels for these greater forces of history and myth and magic that we don't know about. Pardon me. So basically there's the Arjunas and the Kauruvas. They're both like aristocratic families. They've known each other for generations. Duryodhana, he's kind of uppity, like, so the Kauruvas were always like slightly second fiddle to the Arjunas, basically, to the Pandavas, and Duryodhana, he's not having it anymore. He's badass. He's got a huge army. He has kind of he sort of tricked the Kauruvas out of power for the last 10 years, and is kind of is enjoying his power. He's stubborn and kind of stupid, but he's not. And he's kind of bad. From my perspective, he's bad. Anybody who's happy to start a war over whatever, they're not good. But the beauty and complexity of the myth is such that you can, he feels real. You can empathize with him. You can see why you could feel his resentment at the Pandavas, because they've always been second fiddle, and he sees his chance to kind of like trick them into handing over the keys of the kingdom, and he gets it. And and then kind of when he is supposed to kind of give the keys of the kingdom back 10 years later, he sort of like finds a kind of a dishonest way to hold on to power, and the road to war begins kind of because of his stubbornness. And he is like a douche, and he's definitely like the baddies throughout, like certainly within as far as the comic understanding goes. But like, is Duryodhana really the baddie? Like this whole aristocratic structure which they were running ancient India with, it wasn't great, right? And was going to generate terrible war and conflict, practically, continent sinking, planet cracking, billions dead conflict, which is kind of what the Mahabharata is all about, this war. The Bhagavadgita, which is what this bit is about, kind of starts with Arjuna going, I don't want to fight this war. It seems like a really bad idea. I'm friends with, I don't get on with the Kauruvas, but still I know them, and, I respect them. I'm mates with loads of their mates. They're my cousins. We grew up together. My mentor who taught me how to fight is fighting with them now, and that's horrible. This whole big kind of civil war thing and all of those contested loyalties. And Arjuna's a soulful dude, and he's like, do you know what? I know I'm the best warrior and stuff, but just no. I'm just, there's parallels with all the other ancient myths around the world. You could see a little bit of like Achilles in there or whatever. He's like, I'm not fighting. Like, it's not about me. You guys stick your stupid war. I'm not fighting. I'm not gonna spill the blood of my friends on the ground just because we've got ourselves caught up in this weird war thing. And so Krishna, who drives his war chariot, they're kind of like literally the Kauravas and their huge armies are coming the other way, and he's there supposed to be leading the Pandava army, but he's like, just don't want to do it, and like, because he's human, he's right. Why would he do that? Why would you spill the blood of your friends? So Krishna, who's like, okay, so yeah, Pandava's in his war, Arjuna's in his war chariot. It's being driven by Krishna. Krishna is obviously, like a god, an emanation of the Lord Vishnu, who is like the preserver god he's like the middle bit of the kind of the Hindu super god trinity, the preserver, the one who kind of keeps things going. You have a beginning, you have an end. Vishnu is in charge of the bit in the middle where stuff that happens, or stuff that should happen, happens, or stuff that needs to happen, happens. And so he's incarnated as Krishna in this kind of particular emanation. He's riding Arjuna's chariot. He stops time and says, okay, we're going to take time out. And and the whole point of the Mahabharata is him explaining to Arjuna why he does have to fight, why he has to fight, why he can't escape his destiny, basically. And it goes into a really big spiritual thing about like right action. Yeah, it's about doing stuff not because you want to, but because like the historical process, or the kind of the big evil gods who play us like puppets are gonna make it happen anyway, and they need you to do it, and you're gonna do it, and and fate is kind of bigger than one man's desire. Basically, his desire not to do that, not to be pushed down that path, and for good reasons, right? He doesn't want to kill his friends. It's like he's got a really good argument for not wanting to start this war, and and it's going to ruin the entire country. The entire nation, the entire people is at stake in this fight, and millions are going to die. It's going to be awful. And Krishna goes, yeah, but it's kind of happening, and you've got responsibilities to your friends if you want to be human and interpersonal about it. Then you've got, people are going to die because you don't do this. But more than that kind of like human moral imperative, it's a bit more like you do stuff without thinking. You do stuff because it's to be done, and because you're the action that's going to do it. And it's about that point that we've raised a few times in the podcast, that there's no you there doing this. There's just stuff happening, and you're part of the stuff, and you're going to do it. It's about not resisting the flow of history because you think you can or think you should. It's about acknowledging that there's a kind of a greater symmetry there, a greater harmony here that you're not privy to with your fairly limited human perspective, and the things that you think are wrong aren't, or kind of, just do it. Go through the process, trust the process, and things will kind of come out okay. Now, I'm a little bit, my philosophical bent is a bit more humanistic than that. I reckon that Arjuna, was kind of right not to want to kill his buddies, and that might be more important than all of the, do some yoga stuff that Krishna is kind of feeding him with, like the Mahabharata, throughout the explanation of why he needs to do this, Krishna kind of explains the principles of yoga and of karma and of all of these kind of very important spiritual precepts in the Hindu belief system. And it's about evacuating the self from the being and doing the thing that it has fallen to one to do with as much authenticity as your body and soul will give you, kind of thing, but not consciously, not because your ego wants it, because your ego doesn't matter. Yeah, so for me that ain't great, really. I think I find that notion a little bit pessimistic, and that I think the truth of philosophy, and philosophy, I sound like I know what I'm talking about. I really don't. I think the truth is that human subjective experience might be the most important thing. So the thought of those men's bodies lying covered in arrows in a field, screaming and crying and hurting, that might be more important than whatever the god wants, right? So don't do that. Yeah? That's an important act of disobedience that Arjuna doesn't do, right? He's convinced by the end of it. To be fair, Krishna is very convincing, but, and also like Arjuna is a warrior born. He does want to take on Duryodhana. Yeah? Duryodhana has, although like I say, you can, he's not a villain, you can see where he's coming from and kind of appreciate him for who he is. He is a bit of a wally who does, he's got it coming to him, and then a bit of Arjuna does want to do that. And that's another point where maybe this whole kind of problem pops up, is that Arjuna convinces himself that he's doing it for reasons of just, he's doing it without like desire. He's doing it kind of like without, I'm getting my kicks out of this, but secretly he is getting his kicks. He's just getting his bad kicks, like by giving in to his warlike side, even though that's the lesser part of him, the worst part of him. So yeah, big conflicts, forces beyond our control, maybe kind of slightly questionable guys who you shouldn't necessarily listen to, although people do. God dudes, alien demo types, telling humans what to do and kind of magicking them into doing it. Yeah, page 1, we're going on. I'm really sorry. We are going to be here for such a long time. Yeah, I know I always apologise about how long these episodes are. This one could be the worst one yet. I'm really sorry. There's so many ins and outs and highways and byways, and it's fantastic. It's really, really good comics. There's so much richness in here to get into, and I have spent a lot of time in the past, a few weeks or whatever, digging around into all this, having some fun with it. It would just go on forever and ever. I might even split this one into 2 parts, and the second part will be in a couple of weeks' time. I don't know just yet. Professionalism, podcastery, let's do it. So over the page, the story kind of starts. That's our little prologue. Oh dear. How to even begin talking about this? It's so good. We start with a page of writing. This is a great day. Okay, so this is our next 2 pages. We start with a great day. We start with a great day for the artist. It's a good artist's day. This splash page, right? Okay, we're gonna do the credits like we always do when we get to the credits. Okay, so we're on Invincibles, issue 5, Arcadia, part 1. This part is called Bloody Poetry. Bloody Poetry. Grant Morrison, writer. Jill Thompson, pencils. Dennis Kramer, inks. Daniel Votso, colours. Clem Robbins, letters. Julie Rottenberg, assistant editor. Stuart Moore, editor. The Invincibles created by Grant Morrison. We knew that. So, Steve Yowell and Electric Crayon and Co. have gone. Jill Thompson on pencils, Dennis Kramer on inks, and Daniel Votso on colours are in. I can't remember whether Clem Robbins did the letters before. The lettering looks pretty similar. It's great. It's great. Jill Thompson's art is so good in this. And she starts. Okay, so she's already had to do 1 page, but she's starting off. This is when the artist gets to this page. It's a good day for her. You're done by 9:30 in the morning. You take the rest of the day off and go for a walk. Go down the pub or whatever. Go down the pub because it's the 90s. It's just a page of writing, of handwriting. Just a single page, a single picture. And there's some nice peripheral detail around the border, but basically this is a picture of a page of poetry that's just been handwritten by our boy Percy Bysshe Shelley. Bishy? It's not a word you get very much. The fact that he's called Percy is hilarious. My granduncle was called Percy. It's not a cool name. Shelley's a cool name. And we get like kind of the first few lines of Julian and Madelo, a conversation, because we are in northeastern Italy, Venice basically, in 1816, when, and this is the day that Shelley wrote Julian and Madelo, a conversation. Shall I read out the whole thing? I think that Do you know what? I think I won't. Because you can read it yourself. And this entire issue is like a tapestry of other texts and references. We've already had more than one with the whole Wayang Mahabharata Bhagavadgita thing. The rest of this comic is largely built out of Julian and Madelot, Shelley's 1816 or 1818. I've got it written down. Check your notes, you idiot. Yeah, 1818 poem. So this took place in... Oh, no, 1816 was Frankenstein. Okay, sorry, okay. So yeah, this took place in 1818. It was published in 1824, a bit after Shelley died. Okay, so this was written in 1818, but it wasn't published in his lifetime. But it is lovely. It is brilliant. We'll get to the really good bit in a few pages' time. But yeah, go and read Julian and Madelot, A Conversation, if you haven't, because it won't take you terribly long, and you will have a really, really, really good time in it. I hadn't read. Well, maybe I had. I don't think. Like, if I'm honest with myself, I probably hadn't read it before the other week when I was doing the research for this. I read a bunch of Shelley and Byron when I was a soulful teenager. I don't think I did on the back of this. I think I just did because that was kind of how I rolled. Cool kid. And I don't think I ever came across this one. Okay. The next, so we're on to page. So yeah, okay. So we're on to page 3, and what we've got is basically a dramatization in comic book form of what's happening in Julian and Madelot. This poem is basically two thinly fictionalized versions of Shelley and his real life mate Byron. They're having a kind of a debate. It's not really a debate. It's more like a chat. But it's nice to think of it as a debate. They're walking around. They're having a debate. They're having a good time. They go and visit a guy in a lunatic asylum, a mental health unit or whatever. That's probably what we'd call it these days. And they're doing it because like they think that they can find the answer to their debate in the lunatic asylum, but really everyone knows that just kind of going to poke around in the lunatic asylum is something that posh people like to do sort of in the olden days. So I think that there's probably a fair bit of retroactive serendipity on Shelley's part here about going, oh yeah, well actually we went to the lunatic asylum on purpose to find out the answer to my poem. But they probably didn't, let's be honest. They are having a debate. Like I say, it's not really a debate, but it kind of feels a bit like one. Shelley, okay, in a nutshell, I've got a list of what the debate's about, okay, and the different sides of it that they take. Shelley's talking about basically about determinism versus destiny. The right or the possibility of man to create himself, or is there like a greater force which is commanding his destiny for him? You can obviously see where the parallels with what we were talking about with Krishna and Arjuna were a minute ago. Byron, he's not really talking about... So, like, Shelley's talking about determinism and destiny himself, and Byron isn't really engaging in the debate. He's kind of standing off to a side going, it's all a load of bollocks, mate. What are you worrying about? It just is what it is. Don't worry about it. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely Arjuna is Shelley, Krishna is Byron, a bit like as in like whatever will be. Just get on with it. What first struck me, there's a hell of a lot more to it than this, but what first struck me when I read this for this reread was that at the end of the last episode, we had been talking about the Britpop Wars in the letters page from the previous issue, yeah? We had been talking about Blur versus Oasis, basically. And I hadn't noticed this before, but basically this first page, or page of their debate, which is page 3 of the comic, it's basically Blur versus Oasis again. Byron is Oasis. He's being real and like down to earth. And oh, come on, mate, don't give me any of that bollocks. And Shelley is being Blur. He's happy to... He wants to do the bollocks. He wants to acknowledge his own autonomy, his own drive in men towards liberty, as he says it. He wants to kind of make his poetry lofty and make its purpose lofty, whereas Byron is quite happy to just to do it for the fun of it, just do it for the cigarettes and the alcohol of it. Yeah. And I hadn't thought that before. And there's the debate is kind of better than the Britpop Wars, but it is definitely that. And it's interesting that it mattered enough at the time for it to have popped up in the comic as well as in the letters page. In the letters page, everyone was talking about it because that's just what people talked about. But to write a comic about it, or to have the comic be about the same thing, is a parallel that I hadn't really considered before, and is quite interesting. What do we say next? I'm so sorry about this. I'm going to be really pausing a lot. I'm going to be referring to my notes because I don't know how terribly complex this is, but there is a lot there. And there are many, many ways into this that we could have. I'm not convinced I'm picking the best one, but let's do this. Okay, so I've written a few words down because they're helpful about what's going on in this kind of chat, debate, sort of just lads having a muck about between. Sorry, I'm being really stupid. Between Byron and Shelley. So we've got. I've done the thing that you do when you're doing your A levels, and I've got some columns and I've got some opposing terms. Okay, we've got some binaries, and then we're gonna dialecticalize them a bit later. So the poem is called Julian and Madelot. Right within the body of the poem, although Shelley's writing it, so really everyone in the poem is Shelley. Like in the same way that when you dream about somebody else, it's not that other person; it's just you. Or is it? Julian is Shelley. Madelot is Julian, or Shelley is angelic. Byron is demonic. Shelley is idealistic or optimistic, and Byron is cynical or materialistic. Shelley believes in... I kind of got this. This is kind of doubt. Okay, so Shelley believes in the life of the mind. Byron believes in the life of the body. Shelley is atheistic. You could make arguments that there is something quite theistic in Byron, but let's go with agnostic. Shelley is concerned with the self-created man. Byron is concerned by the man who is created by destiny and chance. Shelley's viewpoint is aspirational, whereas Byron's is realistic. Shelley is Blur and Byron is Oasis. Done that one already. Shelley is concerned with love, like a kind of a higher love, like a love of the heart. Byron is concerned with lust, a love of the loins, we could say. Although these guys are both romantics, these are kind of late but very important romantic poets as we understand them now, and the way that they understood romance and romanticism and the way that we understand it now is kind of they're connected but a bit different. Shelley's is a romanticism of the air. Byron's is a romanticism of the earth. Shelley is optimistic and Byron is pessimistic. Shelley is utopian. Byron is dystopian, or world as it is. So Shelley is lofty and aspirational. He's kind of he's trying to be better, and also very considered with I can do it myself. There's something in me which is as good as there is in God, and I can create the universe as I want it to be. Not saying that it's easy, but he knows that that's there to be had in the destiny of mankind. Byron is oh, come on, mate, not really. Men are like Byron. Men are like sheep who will obey anyone who kick their asses hard enough. Shelley kind of rephrases this as the winds of circumstance. Do the winds of circumstance play us like Aeolian harps, and we have no music of our own? You can see how there's a lot of stuff about channels for other forces, whether these are musical instruments or comics or poems. It's about ideas that emerge from a non-human place, using humans as a channel or medium, and creation happening on the back of that. We've got some shadows. We've got some shadowy clouds. Remember we had our shadow puppets earlier. Keep an eye out for shadows, guys. We're going to be doing a bit of shadow work later. So we're deep in the middle of this dramatization of this very famous and very good, very beautiful poem. And less than 4 panels in, Byron switches the script up already, and suddenly we're talking about something else. Another text that we add to the palimpsest or the tapestry that's kind of going to take us through this issue and these next few issues, which are going to be a trick, man. This isn't going to be easy. I'm really sorry about how long and rambling these podcasts are. I don't think there's any other way to do it. Byron says this. There's a painting by Monsieur Poussin, the Frenchman. It shows 3 shepherds and a shepherdess in an ideal landscape, the Arcadia of the Greeks. These 3 stand by a tomb and are seen to contemplate the Latin inscription carved there, et in Arcadia ego, which Shelley helpfully translates as, and in paradise I am. Exactly, rejoins Byron. Even in those sun-kissed vales, a grinning skeleton bares his teeth, mocking our dreams of a perfected world. I'll drink to that fine fellow anytime. So Poussin, et in Arcadia ego, and Poussin's painting Les Bergères d'Arcadie. Oh, my French accent's gone well south. It's gone well Brexit. Les Bergères d'Arcadie, the shepherds of Arcadia. There's already a lot of these different texts working, right? We'll get to Poussin and this picture that we're talking about here in a little while, and kind of some of the implications of it. But I really don't know where to stop with some of these implications. So let's just play it by ear. Let's see how long we've been going. The next 2 pages, they're drinking, they're chatting about who they are, and they hop on a gondola, and they head up to. They head into Venice, basically. What's really good about this? So it is great, and Morrison has a really nice feel for his heroes, Byron and Shelley. And Byron and Shelley are kind of everyone's heroes, right? They Shelley is this kind of like perfect, pure heart. He wasn't really, he did just like ditch his wife and kids and go off with Mary, but the kind of the ideas he did transmit are beautiful and lofty and some of the greatest ideas that humans can aspire to, and Byron was the first rock star again, like a humanist, as in like he was a guy who cared, right, but was also didn't, and was also like a massive dick, and was also just like, I'm just going to enjoy myself. And that's kind of, as I've said, that hedonism is part of the spirit of the time in which this is written. It's part of the spirit in you and in me as well. Don't deny it. And just the fact that Byron went, oh my goodness, the world is so the world is such a farting, pissing, shitting mess. He couldn't make head nor tail of it. He was just going to enjoy it, and kind of did. He created some he left human lives were left in his wake, destroyed. But, and this is really important, the cat could write. Okay, Byron doesn't get read as much as Shelley these days, but his verse is just ridiculously good. Like, his rhymes are on point, and they're funny, and they're exciting, and they're beautiful, and they're sensitive, and they slide around with this real kind of like devil-may-care attitude, which you don't really associate people in the early 19th century as being able to have, right? Like, I really recommend reading some of read Don Juan, right? That's really fun. It's long, you don't have to read all of it, just read a bit of it. It's really good fun, and there's a kind of a swagger to it which feels really modern, and which are really like, I didn't realise that there was such a kind of a slyness and such a kind of a fun wink to these romantic poets, who are often seen as being a bit kind of wet and over complex. The complexity in Byron is kind of really put to the service of having a good time, and he was hugely popular because it's really good fun to read his stuff, especially when, like, as I say, everybody is still waiting for the TV to be invented. And what's really nice about this is that these two kind of like poet rock stars are basically hanging out and getting drunk, and they're continuing their debate. But just like the interplay between them, and this isn't just Morrison by any shot, because Jill Thompson's art really shows her to be an expert at body language in this entire issue, but especially in this, just the way they're kind of hanging out with each other. You feel their friendship. Remember how we felt the friendship between Tom and Dane kind of gently growing over the previous 4 issues, or over the last 3 issues rather. That friendshipy thing, that kind of like way of people relating to each other, it's not something that comics are very good at writing, and yet Morrison's done it twice now, with the help of his artist. As I say, Jill Thompson's art here is absolutely gorgeous, and it's got such a nice, just kind of delicate yet kind of tactile feel to it. It's really good. Okay. So they are talking about. Byron's like, oh come on, mate, we're just a couple of poets. I'm a rock star. You're not even that. You're like so indie that nobody even buys your records. But our poetry will outlive them, George. A cannon fires only once, but words detonate across centuries. Shelley is saying here that, in a way, poems are like time machines, right? They can travel across centuries. One day men and women will be equal and free from tyranny, free of God and fear, and we will have helped to hasten that day with our words. Okay, so they're trying to build a better society with their poetry. You know, that's what every artist wants to do. It's what every person wants to do. Whether your art is cooking, whether your art is finance, whether your art is architecture, whether your art is nursing, whether your art is teaching, whether your art is podcasting, the most important of arts. People do it for the purposes of making the world better, right? Because the alternative, a world that hasn't got that kind of stuff in it, is no world at all. Byron rejoins, you talk utopia, but there was not one damned utopia that did not set its foundations in human suffering and pain. It begins with fancy words, but always ends in blood. Think of the terror in France, the hideous mountains of severed heads. We're in kind of like post-revolutionary Europe here, of course. Shelley says not to fall prey to cynicism and despair. The utopia I speak of lies in the heart, and it grows, and our poetry can help it grow. This is also the point at which Shelley refers to Blake, which connects us back to our previous episodes, of course. Did Blake not speak of mind-forged manacles? Gods and devils make terrified infants of us all. We must do away with them and stand up tall, be all that we can dream of, be happy, high, and majestical. Which Byron, in his, as we're getting to grips with already, in his kind of like cynical and reflexive way, says, kind of looks ruefully at the bottle of wine that he's drinking, which, he often maybe thought of as the point where he would find his salvation, and says that some have different dreams. The connection back with Blake is fairly interesting. I think we might as well get into it. I've kind of alluded to it already, but part of the things that we're uncovering with the Invisible podcast is that this comic is about as much as what it carefully omits or kind of like gestures towards, rather than what's actually in it. Which is maybe why we anchor ourselves to the physical object so much, because we need to have something to literally grab onto there, when the rest of it is very much up for grabs still. One of the things that we've got here is, lineages, silver chains. Remember our silver archer, Arjuna, earlier. Silver chains of association and kind of cultural influence, which are maybe building up to the Invisibles as we learn to understand them through the comic now. So there's the cultural lineage that we have here. I would reflect upon what Shelley was saying a moment ago about our utopias being built out of words and growing, and reflect upon Byron's kind of physical lineage, his children. We'll get to that in another episode, I think. But it's important. And kind of for the moment, what we're thinking of is the way that Shelley kind of explicitly identifies himself with Blake's mission, Blake's project of very deliberately developing a mystical philosophy, a poetical philosophy of his own, which held liberation in this fairly nebulous kind of invisible-y construction of the term as its highest moral principle. pardon me, Shelley is, here he kind of identifies himself as a fellow traveller of Blake's and one who, agrees with him essentially about the importance of that liberatory principle, about the importance of that. Did Shelley know Blake, though? I think that's kind of interesting. I think probably he did. He definitely would be a fan of his, although Blake wasn't famous until after Blake died. Shelley is obviously fairly hip and knows his poetry. He, would know the London scene. He probably does know Blake. He's also kind of got a weird, like, semi-removey relationship with Blake, which means they may well have been at the same parties. Blake is... Okay, I've got it written down because I'm rubbish with numbers. So Blake is... so Byron's about 4 years older than Shelley. At this point, they're both, like, in their mid-20s. Byron is, late 20s. Yeah, Shelley is 28. Shelley's like 24. Blake, has got about 30 years on Byron, 35 years on Shelley, more or less. And yet he outlives both of them. He was born long before them. He was well into his thing before they were born. He's kind of like the previous generation of romantic. You've kind of got Wordsworth and Coleridge, who we talked about Wordsworth in a couple of issues ago. In between there is the kind of the middle generation, if you like. But Blake is obviously like, although he's not kind of achieved like Blakehood yet, like Blake status, because he's still alive at this point, even though he seems like a guy from a previous generation. Shelley probably knew him. Like, there are weird... Okay, so if we look at Mary Shelley, we'll get into Mary Shelley again in another issue. Like, Arcadia is a 4-episode arc, and we're going to be hanging out with these guys a lot. So if I'm promising that we'll deal with them in a later issue, like, we will. But there's an interesting, if we can say that George Bush is maybe Aleister Crowley's grandson or great-grandson or whatever it is, we can maybe say that Mary Shelley is William Blake's daughter. We know that Mary Wollstonecraft, and we know that William Godwin were up for it, pretty much. They have very progressive views for their time. We know that Blake was like a member of a mystical orgy gang. We know that Mary Shelley was born when Blake was about 40 in 1797. So at this point, Mary Shelley is in her late teens, early 20s. We also know that there was definitely some kind of connection between Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mum, and William Blake, because Blake did some illustrations for some of her writing, and there's theories that one of this kind of like Gollum-y figures that Blake drew for Mary Wollstonecraft actually would have gone on to influence Mary Shelley's thinking around Frankenstein and stuff. The stuff these guys got up to, it's not impossible that William Blake could be Mary Shelley's dad. It's a bit ridiculous and unlikely, but we're taking the Invisibles as like a springboard, right? And we're using it to speculate in the hope that the further out we get, the closer to the heart of what the Invisibles is about might be. It's maybe a slightly odd hope, but that's what we're going with, guys. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. So Shelley's kind of on the Blake team. We know that the Blake team heavily influenced the look and feel and philosophy of the parallel universe, like the kind of the utopian starlight London that Dane and Tom went into a couple of issues back. So we're drawing up all of these connections together. But yeah. I mean, we also know that there's this kind of negative force at work. There's the forces of darkness are at work as well, right? And we know that there's shadows involved too. We know that there's shadows which may or may not be simple as this is light, this is dark. Yeah, and this guy, and like Byron has a slightly creepy look on his face here when he says some have different dreams, and it is very marked in comparison to how Shelley has been talking about his utopia. Do we trust Byron? The brighter the light, the darker the shadow, Byron goes on to say, and that's that's kind of more about the themes of this episode and this arc than it necessarily is about him being a goodie or a baddie. But we'll get on to Byron. Byron's legacy is really complicated. And while he's saying this, they're looking at this bell tower, Campanile, which belongs to this building here. And he says, up on the second panel on page 5, listen, there is the asylum bell calling the mad to vespers and prayer. And it's this bell tower here. Now, we'll talk about the location of this bell tower in more depth later, but basically all you need to know is I'm pretty sure that this bell tower isn't real. I don't think you've actually got it. It's very much in the local style. It definitely looks like a Venetian bell tower. It looks a bit like a kind of a slightly more quickly drawn version of San Mark's, the famous one. There's another one that it kind of could be. I think this particular island in the Venetian lagoon that they're talking about, I don't think it had a bell tower quite that tall. But it works for various reasons for the scene that we've got constructed here, insofar as the ringing bell gives them, it moves their conversation on, and we get this beautifully coloured bit by, let me just remind myself, colours on this by good old Daniel Vozzo again. This, like the sky, it's sunset, but the sky has gone purple. Remember how the obelisk, the pyramid-headed obelisk of Canary Wharf in London, was built upon a energy line, a ley line, to disrupt and absorb the power in the local vicinity, and it turned the sky purple. So we've got this happening again right here in in 19th century Venice. Okay, quick panel, quick scene change. We're back to King Mob. We're back in Indonesia. We are at the beautiful temple. I've never been there, but it looks beautiful, of Prambanan, which is like this enormous Hindu temple in the middle of like the big island of Indonesia. Basically, they're in the west bit of the temple, which is the one devoted to Shiva, who is the destroyer. So Krishna, who we kind of alluded to earlier, is the preserver of Hindu mythology. He's the middle of the Trinity. Shiva is the end. Krishna preserves, sustains, keeps existence going in its own particular way. Shiva then comes along and destroys it, and changes it up into kind of nature, into its new form. That's where they are now, and they are at they're at the temple of Shiva. They are praying to another to an avatar of Shiva, in much the same way that Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. Ganesh, this elephant guy, they're praying to him. This is so because he's got his own little kind of in the western part of the temple. He's got his own little bit as well. You could just see. Oh, I didn't know that. I think that's Shiva there. You can just see him behind the head of this guy who's a buddy of King Mob's. They were up late partying after they saw the Wayang performance. Our boy here, not King Mob, but his mate, had too much to drink last night, too much to smoke, and an American girl keeping him up all night. Now, the only American girl that we've met, we've got two American girls in play. One is Boy, the if you'll remember, street girl from New York City, and the other is the other is Ragged Robin. I don't think we actually know if she's American yet. You can kind of tell from the way that she's dressed. Interestingly, let's get to that when we get to her. Or just like there's another random American tourist who's been, keeping our boy here up all night. His name is Agus. Agus is a name meaning he's a good guy. It means he's a good guy. He's a local to Indonesia, friend of King Mob's. Spoilers, we don't see him again. He obviously knows his stuff. He knows a lot about Wayang. He knows a lot about the temple. He's obviously kind of semi-invisible at least, and he's a mate with King Mobs. He likes to stay up late and smoke too much with American girls. Sounds all right. But we don't see him again. So he's definitely like a bit player in this. And it's kind of all there. It's kind of all there on the page. You know, Ganesh is a favourite of King Mobs, like bold people like him. Don't know if you can see him back there, but you know, useful guy to have around. He likes to make a dedication to him at the start of any big venture. We know that this, you know, we know we're at the start of a new story arc, so maybe that's the big venture that we're talking about. His number is 9, so we're here at 9 o'clock. There's this weird, there's this very kind of quaint, it's not your kind of thing, is it, Agus? This is King Bob saying this. I know it's not your kind of thing, is it, Agus? You're a one God man, Allah Akbar. And then Agus replies, God is big. And King Bob says, yeah, our God is bigger than your God. It's just a strangely, like, if you think about how the kind of the outer culture and the underculture actually in the West interacted with notions of Islam, Indonesia being, you know, lots of Muslims there, like the fact that he would kind of like chuck this around, and that it would kind of be, it would have like a fairly innocent connotation to American comic books, which have been kind of at the forefront of leading the propaganda charge against this, you know, or sorry, towards this notion that kind of like we're at war with the Muslim world, which has caused us no end of nonsense, and is not something that we endorse here on the Invisible Podcast. If you tie all of that up, it really leaps out now as something which you don't get 25 years later, or that appears like inappropriate. But yeah, so there's a tiny little bit of you know, comparative religion chat going on here. The most interesting thing on this page, I think, is on panel 2. I don't know if you can see this, but the reflection of the beautiful Baroque sculpture of Prambanan, or not a sculpture, but just the you know, just the kind of the design of the buildings, the kind of the way that the buildings have been built, and the kind of the reflection of the statue of Ganesh in the like the Lennons. King Mob is wearing Lennons. They're a type of sunglasses that were popular. They're kind of popular at the time, a couple of years earlier than this, really. That he's wearing. They're named after John Lennon because he used to wear them, but like shades rather than just like glasses. Those, you know, round rimless glasses. In the reflection, King Mob's eye looks a bit reptilian and creepy. He looks a bit reptilian and creepy if you look closely. And as much as we're like, as much, you know, we know from Dane's perspective that King Mob's a bit like, kind of annoying because like bold guys, you know. But we've also seen him like totally kick ass and like and shoot loads of baddies who needed shooting, or you know, shoot loads of baddies. And we kind of think he's a goodie, but there's you know, maybe not. There's a lot of reason, you know. There's this, and this is well early on for thoughts around that. And Jill Thompson's art on it is brilliant. It's really subtle, but it definitely looks like he's got a very creepy eye, like a monstrous eye underneath his own shades. They leave the temple, and Agus says to King Mob, "Are you going to take a plane back to England?" Because he's made the offering to Ganesh. He's kind of, you know, for his big venture. Presumably the big venture involves going back to England. And King Mob's reply is interesting. Not this time. I just can't face the jet lag. I'll probably take one of my shortcuts. So, on the next page, on the facing page, so, you know, as much as like people were happy to give them a nice big gatefold cover with its interesting design and layout and heavy expensive paper stock, and, you know, foregoing the adverts on the inside pages, we definitely do get an advert on page 7, which is one of the pages where comic books tend to fall open to naturally, or certainly did when they were built like this and made out of this kind of paper. Jurassic Park. You can get yourself a rad little, this is the commercial break section, get yourself a lovely little Velociraptor statue there. You know, if you look at the Velociraptor's eye quite closely, it looks a bit like King Mob's eye in the glasses that I was just talking about. This is we're on page 6, by the way. We're looking at the unnumbered page facing page 6. So scary lizards, scary reptiles, scary lizards. What else do we say about this? I mean, this is a very normie thing to say. I'm really sorry, but like, we know now that velociraptors are more like big, scary chickens. Not that there's nothing, not that doesn't make them scary. A big, scary chicken sounds pretty scary to me. But feathers and stuff, like we think that as much as you can't really admit it in the Jurassic Park films, which are still going, my goodness, this isn't a terribly convincing, I think, portrait of what a velociraptor would actually look like. I mean, I think we know that now. That impression will probably change again in the next 25 years. But this is just a scary reptoid. It's not a velociraptor. It's just a scary reptoid, and it's been genetically engineered. You remember that? We used to have that, and now we've got it, and we've got it again. It was not. It used to be really 90s genetic engineering, and now it's not. It's normal again with like CRISPR and genetic therapies and stuff, which probably might not be a bad thing, but I'm glad it's not me who has to take responsibility for going and fiddling around with those things, because it sounds like a risk. Over the page, onto page 7, the numbered page. More shadows, more shadow play, and we are in a great, nice little 2-page sequence here with Boy and Dane. Boy, remember, is our street girl from New York City. They're in. It looks like a New York loft. It doesn't look like a London loft, but they're in a loft in London. And there's sunlight pouring through the windows. I think we have to think that this episode is probably happening around spring 1995. Like, if you remember, when Dane's London initiation was finished, it was kind of like early spring. This is probably like May, so like late spring, moving into proper summer. And the sunlight pouring in through the windows reflects that. Even though this issue comes out in like January 1995, we've got 4 episodes here, which are going to take 4 months to come out. By the time this arc is finished, and we'll assume it takes place over the course of a few days or something, we will be caught up roughly to where we are in real time. If this is set in early mid 95, this is syncing up quite nicely when you kind of factor in comic book distribution schedules and stuff. So it's summer in London in 1995. That was a good place to be. This one of Jill Thompson's many talents is that she draws. I mentioned that she draws bodies very well previously, but she draws clothes well. This T-shirt is missing the Adidas logo that it kind of would normally have, but the one that Dane's wearing. But it's spot on. This is exactly what people his age were wearing. Similarly, and there's quite a nice little thing here. So Dane is wearing like retro Adidas, and Boy is wearing non-retro, like sporty urban Adidas. This was kind of like the brand management within the fashion at the time, was that you kind of had the retro one, and actually that wasn't really managed by Adidas themselves. That was just people buying vintage clothing, but back when it was kind of cheap, or at least cheaper than it is than you'd find it now. And like the mainstream Adidas stuff is kind of here, and this fits them quite well. She's like American New World hip hop, and he's kind of like old world retro Britpop, right? He's got the right hair and everything. They're learning Aikido, Sajujugi, basic 4-directional punch. Dane is complaining. Jack Frost, we call him now, and he's like, I hate being called Jack Frost. I'm only doing it because Tom said. I don't know how I got myself into this shit. But it's fun. Like she's enjoying punching him because he's so annoying. and she's good at martial arts. We can see that from the way she's moving. And Dane, as much as he's complaining, Jack is learning. You know, like he's got nothing better to do. You know, lady from New York teaching you how to do kung fu, aikido in a loft in London in the summer of 1995. It's fine. It's good. It's a nice afternoon. You wouldn't complain too much, or at least you'd be surly and kind of complain, but secretly you'd be loving it. And it's easy to think that Dane is. She does let through. You know, she feels in a bit of like context for why Jack, has been recruited for the Invisibles. We got you into this. Every invisible cell has 5 members, right? It's all based on elemental symbolism. Oh, I'm not doing a New York accent. I could do. It's all based on elemental symbolism. Oh, no, that's not a girl's voice, though, is it? Earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. I'm not sure if I can do a very good New York accent. I'm really sorry. Something happened to one of our members, and we had to bring in a replacement. Ooh. So we heard about this back in issue 1, where Dane has been brought in to replace somebody who doesn't appear to have died. It's not as complicated. It's not as simple as that. It's more complicated than that. But they need a replacement, and Dane is it. She's not letting away much more, but she does say something interesting, that invisible cells have 5 members, and they're based on elemental symbolism: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. So that's nice. So there's a nice little game that we can play now in here about who and what the elements, the members of this invisible cell that we know about, correspond to, right? Who, like, which role they're playing each. With Dane, you'd have to go with, either spirit or fire, right? Because, you know, I would say probably fire, because he's wearing a red t-shirt in this. She's wearing a blue top, so by that same logic we might might think of her as water. King Mob, he's like, it's kind of his cell, right? We're getting that already. We know that he's sort of in charge and is kind of like the alpha of all of this. So let's say he's the spirit, because you know, he's the one kind of bringing the direction to it and stuff. Which leaves Lord Fanny and Ragged Robin to be earth and air, right? So we'll see if that fits with them later. But yeah, okay, so this is really good art, again, by Jill Thompson. Not only the clothing is really on point, but like the anatomy and just like the body languagey stuff. There's a good, she's very nicely made us think that boy is slowly putting, you know, she's doing we can tell she's very good at kung fu here, right? Because she's kicked Dane in the face, but she's missed his face and just kind of put her foot right up against it. She's holding it there, like, you know, effortlessly, and then kind of folds her leg back under her and sits down. It's like, oh, that's like you've seen it in the movies, right? That's a kung fu power move. She's really good. And she's kind of like bantering a bit with Dane, but she's not taking any of his nonsense. And she seems cool. She seems all right. We like her. Over the page, we've got another advert, another commercial break. This is an advert for White Wolf Fiction, an imprint owned by, I don't know, probably by Warner Brothers or something. Doomed World, one of the 2 anthologies of like fantasy fiction, basically. One of them, okay, so the imprint is, so the publishing house is called White Wolf Fiction. The imprint that these 2 anthologies of like new fantasy fiction is published under is called Doomed World. One of them is called Dark Destiny, which has got Robert Bloch. It's really weird, right? On the advert, it's pronounced Robert Bloch. It's spelt Robert Bloch, Block, but I'm pretty sure they mean Robert Bloch with an H. In fact, here, so in the advertorial, they've spelt his name right on the front cover, or on this mock-up of the front cover of the book itself. They've got his name wrong, which is not great. Journey through, you know, so this is like a kind of an anthology of like, yeah, you know, darkish fantasy. Journey through realms of nightmare. Experience a gothic punk world where vampires, werewolves, and mages stalk unseen among humanity. A world where supernatural creatures and powers have changed the course of history, shaped society, and toyed with global events. A world not unlike our own. This all sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? This all sounds very on brand. All sounds very of a piece with what we've got here. This was in the air. What can I say? Nancy Collins. I'm pretty sure Nancy Collins, I think she did a good run on Swamp Thing, right? Ride with the Prince of Blood on the trail of outlaw werewolves in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. It sounds great. I would. And then there's two adverts. There's adverts for two books. Two books are featured on this advert. One is this one, Dark Destiny. The other one looks more fun, if I'm honest. It's like a collection of books by other people, including Nancy Collins again, but also including Neil Gaiman, who's you've heard of him. Howard Ellison's writing for Dark Destiny. Actually, maybe that's the best thing. R.I.P. Maybe Dark Destiny would be best. So Elric, the Eternal Champion, like the albino guy with the sword from the Michael Moorcock novels. Stormbringer and Elric of Marylebone and all that. This is like a collection of stuff, of fiction. Moorcock looks like he's doing one of them, but a bunch of other people, including Neil Gaiman, writing their own takes on Elric, one emanation, if you like, of Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion, Mythos. I think I've just invented something there, Mythos. So Michael Moorcock's Elric, Eternal Champion, Mythos, has its own anthology of special fiction here. The tortured albino prince and his demon sword Stormbringer explore Arthurian England, Renaissance Milan, Nazi Germany, contemporary New York, and many other realms. It sounds very of a piece with the Invisibles. Why wouldn't you like it? But also the Moorcock thing and the Eternal Champion thing, they're going to pop up in just a minute. And over the page, did I mention San Servolo before? San Servolo. Before. Maybe I did. But we're back in Venice with Byron and Shelley over on the numbered page 9. We return to them after our little commercial break. How do I start talking about this? Okay, so I've only been to Venice once personally, and it was about 10 years ago, and I had a lovely time. I was just there for work for about 3 days. I had to flog some textbooks to some academics, basically, and it involved sitting on next to a big pile of books for 3 days in a shaded, sunny veranda with a free bar selling like Aperol Spritz, which nobody had heard of at the time, even though it's a bit passé now. Reading, sitting in the sun every couple of hours, like a kind of a sweating academic would walk past. It was like middle of the summer, would walk past, and I'd sort of half-heartedly try and flog him a book, and they'd be like, "Oh no, it's fine," and I'd be like, "Yeah, great, leave me alone." I hadn't thought about it for years until I was doing my research for this. I remember quite clearly, now that I've explored my memories a little bit, that I was reading Generation Kill by, I think the guy's name is Ewan Wright or something, whose book was, adapted into a TV show. It's all about effed up recon Marines leading the charge into Iraq with an embedded reporter. So it's a real life thing. In 2003, and it kind of under the guise of like criticizing the kind of the brutality of our boys, it just really champions them, and it's just like, aren't these guys the most awesome thing? They just like play video games and do like legal army speed and kill baddies all day, and they're really effed up, but that effed upness is cool, right? We like that. I read that. It's very readable and kind of nightmarish in its own way, as all of that military propaganda is. And you feel a bit guilty for reading it while you enjoy it at the same time. And the other thing I read was Zizek's book Violence, which actually has a big long quote. There's a bit where Zizek really nails his colours to the mast of Neil Gaiman, and kind of has a big long quote and says, "Yeah, Gaiman's great." The point of Violence, if I remember correctly, the book's called Violence. If I remember correctly, is violence is bad unless it's divine violence, which kind of kind of fulfills the purpose of divine violence, and the kind of who gets to decide what divine violence is unclear. Obviously, there's a clue in the name, and that would be God. But Zizek isn't like a Christian, or he doesn't really have a religion beyond Stalin or whatever. Irono-Stalinism, and like a couple of like examples of divine violence that he gives in the book. This is kind of what I'm saying is it ties into our themes here, right? He says that divine violence is like a force of kind of like, is like a social force moving through perhaps a mob or a crowd or a historical process which can't really be resisted. So he would say that one of these things was the French Revolution, and he uses it to justify the terror somewhat, which now that I talk about it, is incredibly relevant to the stuff that we're talking about here. Now, okay, so this is where I get to it. This conference thing where I was flogging books in the sunshine and enjoying myself and just having a lovely time reading, was here. Was on the island of San Servolo, kind of in the Venetian lagoon. And I feel, when I discovered this the other day, I felt strangely... I don't know what I'm trying to say. Strangely regretful. Okay, so basically I had wandered so far away from the Invisibles at that point 10 years ago that I didn't even realise when I was there that I was going to the bit in the Invisibles where Shelley and Byron go. Right? Now, and from previous episodes of the Invisible podcast how interested I am in the geography of the places of where they go, and spent a certain amount of time in my youth tracking, like just happening to be around some of the places that are in the London stuff that we saw in the previous few issues. And it turns out I'd also been to this bit where Byron and Shelley go now. Right? We know this because this is a scene from the poem from Julian and Madelo again. At the time, San Servolo was, and there's a museum on the island now, San Servolo was the lunatic asylum for sorry for that using that term, but it was the lunatic asylum for Venice, the city, and environs, and there's a museum kind of about that now. The rest of the this is a tiny island; it's only a couple of football pitches big or so. The rest of the island is owned by the University of Venice or whatever, or some university in Venice, and there's a big old island. They trade a bit on the heritage of having this like crazy far out, kind of brutal medievally. Old, but cleaned up lunatic asylum. Now, I'm going to keep saying lunatic asylum, even though it makes me uncomfortable, because that is what people would have called it. And I was there for 3 days, and I didn't even realise. So I feel like I became quite detached from. At that point, I had become quite detached from the younger man that I was at some point, and reading this and remembering and realising that I had been there. Has kind of got to me a little bit. It's kind of touched me a bit in since I've been researching this issue, and great, it's nice that I may have forgotten that thread, but that thread hadn't forgotten me and was still moving me around where I wanted to go. My memories of San Salvador was that it was divine. Basically, it was beautiful. The sunlight there in Venice was just it's just wonderful. One of my favourite things about going to countries with slightly better climates than the UK is like you get lizards. And at one point, I did go into Venice a couple of times, and had and it was cool and stuff. But mainly I sort of stayed on the island because, like I say, I was working. I did have to stay fairly close. But during a couple of breaks, I went to certain bits of the university were still under like these new university buildings next to all the old buildings of the asylum and stuff. Which by the way, this tower isn't at. So that's how I know from earlier that tower is an artistic, interpolation on Jill Thompson's part, and it fits the story, so it's fine. But it's not like shouldn't be taken off as being a map necessarily of the island itself. I went, so they're building student accommodation and kind of conference areas and stuff. And I had a wander around there. There's tennis courts. and half of it was like a building site, but half of the building site, they weren't trying terribly hard to build this stuff up. It was just a bit left. So I went for a wander, and it kind of, because of the quality of the light there, I was thinking of J.G. Ballard a lot of the time, who was publishing, or who had published, was publishing around the time this came out, in fact, was publishing, his kind of like Can trilogy, which is all about like the effect of Mediterranean sunlight on the middle classes, basically. And I was walking around this kind of like, very sort of like slick, kind of like bourgeois posh accommodation for academics on the one hand, and this kind of like bit that was kind of tucked away behind it that hadn't been built up yet and was quite kind of just a bit rubbly and a bit kind of crap, and then all of these whitewashed buildings. And the lizards, when you go somewhere warm, there's lizards. You don't just get insects and rodents in among the kind of casual fauna that you might be lucky to run across. You get cute little lizards. And the sun was, these ones were little and silver. And the sunlight was reflecting off their backs, and they were moving very quickly. And they were just kind of catching my eye, and it was quite difficult to kind of get one in your eyesight for long enough to actually look at it. And I remember being struck, but even then, and as I say, I had walked fairly far into Normie land at that point. Even then, I was fairly aware, I think, that these lizards, they definitely seemed, or little reptile guys, remember we've just had our little Jurassic Park page, were telling me about the spirits of the people who used to live on the island. So like generations of very poorly crazy people had been trapped on island in these rather hellish conditions, and all of the light and all of the nice modern architecture and everybody walking around and smiling couldn't wipe that away. And especially when you saw these skittering little lizards with the sunlight reflecting off their backs, there was a very keen sense that these gardens had been wandered by people who were in some quite far out places while they were there, if you know what I mean. And then this week I find that it's in the Invisibles. I mean, what can you say? It was good. It was good to realise that. So what happens is Byron and Shelley, this is all real, and Shelley wrote Julian and Madelot based upon these real events, these real conversations, and this real stuff they did. They have their conversation, and this kind of elides the this kind of scene a bit. So because of the colour of the sky and stuff, you'd very easily think that, because this is where they were going past in their gondola, you'd very easily think they got off the gondola and they went straight to visit the madhouse. We all know that, even though Shelley says it's a hellish place, George, in his, he's more prim than Byron is, obviously. We know that people of Byron and Shelley's class used to love going and looking around the loony bins, and having a laugh at the poor people's expense. So he's saying, "Oh, this is terrible," even though it's a bit like going on a ghost train or something. In terms of like how people like that would spend their leisure time, which they had a lot of. But this isn't then, because Byron does say, "Our debate last night set me thinking." So this is all based on real events. What happened was, Byron and Shelley, they went riding on horses, they got drunk, they had this debate, but then they did go, supposedly, so the history goes, and visit the island of San Servolo, and they went and visited the lunatic asylum there, and they spoke to a man who gave them pause, who let them think. Honestly, I could easily go line by line through this issue, and we could go and we could talk about every line, but we're not going to do that. We're going to be here long enough as it is. Let's not do that. But there's loads of good lines, even on this fairly sparsely written page. Byron's talking about himself. He talks about being the devil, which, he was kind of, there was definite hints towards him being a baddie a bit earlier. Obviously, he says here, Europe sees me as the very devil, and all of the press and the kind of the scandal sheets at the time, what there was of it, was had, Byron was a celebrity, but like a bad celebrity, like a rock star. And Shelley is kind of aware of this too, obviously, and says the devil's greatest failing is that he accepts his place in the scheme of things and never tries to make a heaven of hell, which would, after all, be the ultimate rebellion, right? To kind of like to prove God wrong, that you're the heaven that you were struck. You can build a better heaven than the one you were thrown out of. Why are we here? Shelley asks. Our debate last night, even though it looks like it's the same night, but it's not, had me thinking Shiloh. Shiloh was like a pet name that Byron had for Shelley. And the reason behind it is fairly interesting. In 1813, so about 3 years before this, a woman called Joanna Southcott died. Now, Joanna Southcott was like a prophetess, an occult leader, basically, who kind of gave this. She was big. She was big news in London at the time. She was like a kind of another like celebrity scandal type thing. Very much within the kind of circles of esoteric groups that were clustering around London at the time, of the sort that William Blake was a part of. Like William Blake and Joanna Southcott have a lot in common, or at least not a lot in common, but socially they would have aligned and overlapped in their interests. Southcott was much more famous in her life than Blake was. That's why you can't really compare them very closely. But they definitely were involved in the same milieu, is what I'm trying to say. Southcott and Blake. And Southcott kind of set, like, one of her prophecies was that she was going to give birth to the Messiah before she died, even though she was blatantly way too old and probably too gay to have a have a baby. But kind of having messiahs, you don't really need a man involved, do you? And she was going to call him Shiloh. And this is also, Shiloh is also an early name for the Messiah from the Bible. It's one of those ones where it's like, we don't know why the word Shiloh is in here, but we're assuming that it refers to the Messiah. So it's like an early biblical term for the Messiah. Sorry for saying Messiah so much. It sounds a bit like Shelley, obviously. And we know that if Byron is the devil, then it kind of makes sense for Shelley to be Jesus. He's because they've got this not really oppositional positions in this debate. So that kind of fits nicely. That's why Byron calls Shelley Shiloh, because we've got Jesus and Satan kind of debating here. But it's also quite a funny thing to say that, like, this kind of famous but not very cool woman. That's what I'm getting. She sounds pretty cool to me, but although I'm not, perhaps she was a cult leader, and cult leaders are prone to abuse within their power structures, right? So perhaps there was some bad stuff going on there, but I don't really know enough about Joanna Southcott to kind of cast historical aspersions on her. Byron would have looked down on her, because Byron was probably quite a bad misogynist as well, wasn't he? And he's taken the mickey out of his mate Shelley by saying, "You're like the Messiah that she promised but never delivered. It was you, wasn't it?" It's good. It is a good joke. It is a good nickname to have for your slightly, slightly overly pious mate. Your pious atheist mate. Sorry. Our debate last night set me thinking, Shiloh. I had such a talk with another who came to Venice some months ago, a member of the Invisible College, as we are now gone mad. So a big chunk of the puzzle falls into our lap here. Byron and Shelley are invisibles. They know it, and now we know it. And they've come to the asylum today to meet another invisible. So we know that all of this happened in the real world, right? We know that Julian and Madeleine, Byron and Shelley, met, chatted, and then went to visit a crazy guy. And the crazy guy thought. That's all happening on the page here. I would like to draw your attention to this pillar here, this kind of headless, topless pillar with a bunch of flowers on it. I think when we see flowers in the future in the Invisibles, we're going to think stars. We're going to think about whether that's a star platform. Anyway, that's a digression. I don't want to get into that too much because I could easily trip myself up with it. Arise, sir, wake from your slumber and pray from us. They've gone to the crazy man, stroke wise man, for knowledge. We know that there's this. We know that the Invisibles is enjoying these. Is enjoying playing with these notions of craziness and kind of like magical wisdom in a way which is a bit hashtag problematic, but we don't mind. We're going with it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 candles on the piano, in case you were looking. I'm going to come back to this in a bit because over the page we're back in the cool loft. We're going to say Shoreditch, right? You know, back when it was affordable and there was still like warehouse space you could get there. This is probably where the Invisibles are hanging out. This is probably what they're using for their yoga practice. They've moved on now from Aikido to yoga. and there's still more nice chat, character, relationship building going on between Dane, or Jack, as we should probably get used to calling him, and Boy, our New York City girl from the streets. And they're doing yoga together. She's teaching him yoga. And they're talking about music for a bit. Dane says, "Do you like Naughty by Nature?" Viewer, listener, reader, I've done you a great service this week, and I am on the basis of Jack saying, "Do you like Naughty by Nature?" Boy's response, by the way, is, "They're okay. I grew up with guys like that. It's no big deal. A lot of that stuff's just bullshit. Big guns, big dicks. The girls just laughing and behind their backs. I like dancing to European techno." I like dancing to European techno. I listened to a Naughty by on the back of Dane saying that. I listened to a Naughty by Nature album this year, 1993, which is the one I think he probably would have been most familiar with. It's the one with the hit on it, Hip Hop Hooray, and the timeline of it having come out a little while ago, so that Dane is familiar enough with it to know that he likes them. Even though there's another less popular album that came out in the meantime that he might have known. I listened to it. I did that for you. So what we can say about it is that it is definitely authentic for a guy with Jack's. It's kind of authentic for a guy with Jack's background, being who he is, to like Naughty by Nature. Really, Cypress Hill were more popular back then. And Jack, I think, probably, given Jack's kind of like penchant for like more kind of outward signifiers of rebellion, I think he would have been more into Cypress Hill than Naughty by Nature. If he was a bit cooler, he would have been into the Wu-Tang, obviously. But Biggie and Tupac, they weren't really that big over here yet. Like, you had to be fairly hip-hop intelligentsia to like them. And we know that intelligentsia maybe isn't the right word for Dane. As rawly brainy as he is, he's not like a kind of an elitist in his music taste by any means, and we know that because he likes Naughty by Nature, and it is deeply average. I did struggle through to the end of the album, but I wanted to turn it off a lot. It's not really like awful. It's not bad. It's just that in the examples that I've given, even in Cypress Hill, and if you can get past the annoying rapping in Cypress Hill, the production on it's great actually. Muggs is good. Naughty by Nature is distinctly average, East Coasty, but it's not even New York. Do you know what I mean? It's like New Jersey. Gangster-ish rap with a really like poppy edge. Lots of really like quite bouncy beats in it, which are sort of annoying. So Dane hasn't got great taste in music, right? Boy is from the streets. She's not unfamiliar with hip hop culture. We can kind of she as much admits as it here. She says, I like dancing to European techno. Apologies for the accents and stuff. If you're from Liverpool or America, I really apologise. Okay, but I don't think I'm going to be able to stop. She likes dancing to European techno, and it's like, it is frightening to think about the amounts of ecstasy that King Mob's Invisible Cell might have got through on a night out. Do you know what I mean? Just like, I like dancing to European techno. Sounds like quite a sophisticated thing to say until you sort of reflect on what European techno sort of meant back then. You've got like trancey piano, like dung 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 dung, fall to the floor beats, wee 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 wee, kind of like kind of like helium-y sirens going off all the time. It sounds really quite now, and it's great to imagine the Invisibles rolling up at the club for like a 12-hour basement session with Sven Vath, really digging the deep hard techno. European techno as opposed to British techno, which was a little bit different, a bit more pretentious at the time. Yeah, it's great. It's nice that Boy likes dancing to European techno because it means that she's human, okay? And by human I mean a bit daft, because it's both there's a lot of cultural distance here, historical distance, and I feel very free in mocking these two idiots for their bad taste in music. And there we go. Loads of great European house at the time, but European techno specifically, you listen, a lot of it now you're like, oh, that's quite, because it was taking itself quite serious for such kind of like ecstasy based music, it takes itself quite seriously. I think whereas house music is a bit more poppy, a bit looser, you can have a bit more fun with it. Yeah, the Boy likes dancing to European techno, which is great, and it's also like, wow, you wouldn't expect, but she's a street girl from New York. You wouldn't expect her to like dance to European techno. Well, she does. Okay, she's got the saw jaw to prove it. Techno's I like, man. You should come dancing with me. I'm a fucking great dancer. That'll be important in like a lot of issues time. Yeah, well, if you do this yoga with me, you'll be even better. They do Uttanasana, bending over yoga. Talk about his haircut. We get some more casual homophobia out of Dane. It's too long. She talks about cutting Dane's hair. It's too long. It'll get in your eyes when you're fighting. That's why King Mob's bald. Then is it? It's like, no, it's because he's vain, right? That's anyway. He keeps everybody keeps going on about fighting. We don't know, but he doesn't know who we're meant to be fighting with. We're fighting. She says we're fighting the other side, the forces that want to control people's lives and keep us asleep forever. It's Wake Up Sheeple, but long before the War on Terror. So it's more ideologically forgivable. And he says, you fucking lost me. Don't worry about it. It's better to keep a sense of humor about this stuff. Some people totally lose it in the field. We've got agents out there who don't even remember they're invisibles. We're talking ultra paranoid. These people are operating on the edge of reality, Jack. Cover stories inside cover stories, like Chinese boxes. And then they do Vuxasana. And then Dane has some answers and questions. If nobody knows who's working for who, how do I know I haven't joined the other side? And then, ta-ding, as they enter this groovy stretching obelisk-y pose, they turn into shadows. And she says, Jesus, good question, Jack. Good question. How do they know they haven't joined the other side? They're just shadows, right? They're just shadows on white. The light, as it's been pouring through the window of this East End loft, I don't know if it's really the East End, but it might be, has turned them into shadows at the point of asking that question. But let's go back a little bit. We've got agents out there who don't even remember they're invisibles. We're talking ultra paranoid. So over the page, we don't quite get that link with the ultra paranoid agent yet, but we do get phew, what a scorcher. This links us back to the Elric advert that we had just on the previous spread, because we got a very kind of scary and horrible little pastiche homage thing to the work of Michael Moorcock again. This is about, you can tell this because it starts with that statement, phew, what a scorcher, which is what tabloid newspapers in Britain traditionally say when the weather's hot. That's like the kind of catchphrase for good weather, but good weather means complain about the weather because it's not just nice, it's scorching. It's actually ruining everything. I beg your pardon. We know that this is so as well as Elric being one of the Eternal Champions, another one is Jerry Cornelius. We'll get to him later again in a few story arcs time, because he's a kind of a significant influence upon the Invisibles. The Cornelius books are quite difficult to explain, but one of the kind of the main things that happens in them is that you have headlines ripped from the tabloids somewhat at random, kind of at the start of each chapter. The chapters are very short, a couple of pages often, and the main thing that Jerry Cornelius as a hero or Eternal Champion does is sit around in ruins of like recent conflicts, of recent wars, all in a kind of a post-war sort of 60s onwards, but not often. It's kind of 20th century though, right? Yeah, he skips around in time. He's got a time machine, or he had a time machine, and now time is broken. And what we've got here is it's really horrible, actually. He's talking to this nice woman who's she's nice, but she's not quite right, and she's looking after this baby who is kind of quite badly deformed, kind of cyclopean. It's the chemicals, they were spraying them everywhere. We're in a kind of a bombed out environment somewhere. It could be kind of anywhere, but it looks like a kind of a desert, but it could be anywhere, because this is obviously in some kind of terrible post-apocalyptic, post-war scenario. King Mob is there in a leather vest with nothing, with just like nothing on underneath, and I guess it's really hot, but it's still not a nice thing to wear. In the bombed out ruins of the apocalypse, all of that kind of thing. And he's being kind of glib, and he's taking it in his stride, somewhat to his credit, because this is obviously a slightly tragic situation, and he's not. And although he's taking the mickey a little bit, he is also being nice. He's taking this poor woman and her frightening child at face value. The child's been deformed by, I suppose she is a bit funny looking. It's the chemicals. They were spraying them everywhere. I don't know why she's kind of from London, but why not? And I guess all we can say and know at this stage is that he last said he was going on a shortcut, and this is it. And he says, I'm going back to London. So this is how he travels from the temple where he just was back to London, is via this place, which can't really be any place on Earth, because it's clearly well, I mean, I guess it could be. It could be Fallujah or something, because of the terrible deformity and the climate. In fact, that's quite eerie, that situation, that this environment didn't really exist on Earth yet when this was made, but within 10 years or so it would be. And that's kind of terrifying. We don't really think it's the Middle East though, because the woman there, she's not Arabic or Persian or of any kind of Middle Eastern ethnicity. She's white and blonde, and like I say, has a kind of an English accent. So this is his shortcut, we think, maybe. We know that, like, Dane, when he jumped off Canary Wharf, there was a pretty kind of big sort of sci-fi kind of fictional dimensional shift happening. It wasn't just something which happened in his head. He was very suddenly kind of teleported somewhere else. So we know that, like, teleporting is in play, and maybe this is like a version of that. Maybe this is what King Mob's doing here to get quickly from Indonesia to London to avoid the jet lag. I mean, really, I think jet lag's maybe not as bad as exposing yourself to like a post-nuclear, post-chemical weapons of mass destruction style bombed out desert place thing. I think that might be worse than jet lag, but to each their own. He kind of waves goodbye, and he kind of disappears, like quite deliberately sort of disappears into the distance, leaving the girl and her baby behind. And the tone of it is really odd. It's really brightly lit. There's all of these kind of glib non sequiturs in the dialogue. There's something terrifying about the way the woman is putting a brave face on it when she lives at the end of the world. It's generally the baby's wrapped up in a green sweater, like Three Men and a Baby, which is creepy again. But or do I mean Three Men and a Baby, or do I mean Ghostbusters 2? I don't know, actually. Does it? It may even not be terribly important. But yeah, and so that's a weird little interlude. That's pages 12 and 13, and King Mob in the ruins. She says, "Oh, I know who you remind me of. It's Gandhi from that film, Gandhi." So there's this good sort of flat, bleak humour at work in this, but the overall effect is quite unnerving and unpleasant. And he's not like Gandhi, he's just bold. And it's funny, like Gandhi from that film, Gandhi, because he's not like the real Gandhi. Anyway, let's not linger on that too long, because the space that they're in, this kind of like post-apocalyptic, not a nice place, is the place we'll meet again later. Not meet that much. We're not going to meet it that often, but we will. Over the page again, we have another little brief 2-page interlude, and Orlando finally makes his appearance in this issue, in a brilliant little bit of like serial killer fiction. So we had kind of like a post-apocalyptic, more cockier here. This is like kind of this is like Clive Barker or something. This next double-page spread, we have a nice dad having a nice day out with the kids, buying ice creams. Again, we're in sunny London. There's a cool bit here of I love this little detail here of a dog doing a poo behind the man's head, because you know how when you're getting an ice cream cone, you kind of curl it out from the Mr. Whippy machine. That's a bit like a dog doing a poo sometimes, isn't it? If it's a chocolate 99, which this isn't, then it can often look like that, can't it? And then as dad buys it, that's me, $3.99's lovely. Cheers, mate. It's all very nice, naturalistic dialogue. Dad buys 3 ice creams for him and the kids, and then there's this creepy thing appears from the shadows. This is Orlando, and he's got no face really. He's kind of in shadow, but he's also not kind of in shadow. He's also just standing there, being incredibly creepy, but no one's happening. And it kind of feels like there's some kind of magical aura around him, which is bending people's perception, because this guy kind of approaches him when it's like you wouldn't. And he says, and Orlando says something, it says like the creepiest thing that you could possibly say to somebody who you're approaching at random in a park. He says, "The Aztec god Xipatotec can be identified by his mask and suit of flayed human skin. My native land is the place of the unfleshed." Well, Clive Barkery, like Orlando's like a Cenobite, yeah? From the Hellraiser movies or books. Is there more than one Hellraiser book, or is there just the one? The art, again, is banging. Jill Thompson's doing a brilliant job. What I really like, a little detail here, is that when Orlando first approaches, he's already carrying his own ice cream. So it kind of as if to suggest that he's just been to the ice cream van as well. And you think maybe he hasn't, because this kind of guy who looks a little bit like the guy from Speaker's Corner back in issue 2 with a bit of a haircut, that guy would, I think, really freak out and not serve this guy this very frightening apparition an ice cream. So maybe the ice cream is part of the illusion that he's kind of casting. Maybe it's got something to do with that. But what's really cool is that, I don't know if this is a mistake, but if it is, it's a neatly serendipitous one. So here, he's clearly holding the ice cream in his hand. And then in the next panel, the ice cream is still there, but his hand has gone. Now, we don't know if that's because it's just like I say, like a kind of a magical illusion, and parts of the stability or reality of it are kind of breaking down or kind of fading in and out, or quite possibly it's just it's like an art mistake. Could have been that Thompson didn't bother to draw that hand because she thought that this speech bubble here would be a little bit more this way and would kind of cover up the hand anyway, so she didn't need to draw it. Either way, it's great because it looks like the ice cream cone is just kind of melting back into Orlando's body, not his body but his suit. And it's a lovely little kind of unnerving sort of like detail, and like I say, maybe not even a deliberate one. The Xipatotec thing, I think we're going to go into Aztec mythology again later. I know I'm putting off a lot of stuff, but this is going on long enough already, right? Xipatotec, kind of the flaying thing is like grain, right? It's like you flay off the outside of the grain. He's a god of grain and fertility and that's a violent process. That's kind of you're killing the happy little germ of grain. You flay it off and you take off the outside skin to uncover the life-giving bit that you want underneath. There's obviously a sacrificial element involved in this. Like people, like human sacrifices right up until the end of the Aztec civilization would be given to Xipe Totec. Not really sure how you pronounce that. And the skin would be the sacrifice, right? So kind of like skinlessness is, it's kind of like a nice metaphor in kind of spiritual traditions in a way, because it's like losing one's ego. It's like losing your vanity is to kind of lose your skin, losing your social projection of self, and kind of being left with the real one underneath. Although in this kind of scenario, it's probably not sensible to think that, although that might be kind of like spiritually purifying or even necessary, it's probably not very nice, probably not very pleasant process to go through. You might think about Saint Bartholomew or someone from he was one of the apostles who is often depicted in Catholic art as being flayed, carrying his skin. Look up Saint Bartholomew if you haven't lately. There's some amazing sculptures around the world of him, like without his skin on, holding his skin, and it properly looks like something out of Clive Barker. In fact, it's almost certainly a big inspiration for it. So Orlando says this weird thing to this guy, and instead of the dad, instead of just leaving this terrifying apparition that's talking crazy, kind of gets a bit chippy about it. He's like, "You all right, mate? You got a problem?" And he's like, "No, come here." And there's a really creepy bit, this 3-panel sequence at the top, where the dad walks up to him, kind of disappears behind this tree, and then quite quickly, we feel from just the rhythm of these panels, quite quickly reappears again. So, I think that even an expert flayer and skin stitcher would take a good little while to make a face mask out of a live man that's as well fitting as that. So I think there's magic happening here, right? There's been a strange little illusion of time here. Dad reappears, except clearly it's not Dad. It's Orlando wearing Dad's face. Remember, he can be identified by his mask and suit of flayed skin. It's a really creepy panel. Thompson does a great job of making it look two-dimensional, but it can't. But obviously, time has passed, but not that much time, because the ice creams are only melting a bit. I reckon it could take a full working day to go from Dad to mask as complete as this, and yet, judging by the ice cream melt, only a few minutes going to pass at most. The lovely kids again don't seem to recognise the fact that this is clearly, this is a mask. This is not a man wearing a crudely made mask from their dad's skin, and they kind of run off to go, "Dad, ice cream," and he's like, "Come to Daddy," which is itself actually a line straight from the Hellraiser movie, isn't it? And it's great. It's just a really good kind of tonal insertion here. We've had this kind of this like nasty apocalypse here. Then we've gone much more kind of intimate and like not real world, although it is very recognisably like in a place and time, in the contemporary place and time of the world of the 90s and the London, and it's great. It's a really good little walk in from the horror genre. And then over the page. But it's only 2 pages. It's just a lovely little vignette, really well balanced and well paced. Great little rhythm to it. Loads happens. It's really creepy, and it's over in a second. It's really decent comic writing and comic construction. It's not just in the writing, obviously. And then we're at we cut. It's the evening now, but we're still in London. We think. We're definitely still in London because Robin says so. This is our next page spread, 16 and 17. The rest of the Invisibles minus King Mob, the Invisibles minus King Mob, our guys, our London cell, are having dinner in an Indonesian restaurant, waiting for King Mob to turn up. And that kind of hanging out. And Robin says she's been, they're getting ready for like this mission, that that was alluded to earlier with the Ganesh sacrifice and the undertaking, not the Ganesh sacrifice, but the Ganesh offering, and the kind of the large undertaking that King Mob is preparing for. Ragged Robin is saying it's a shame they've got to leave London because she's just been getting into the shops. She got some nice boots in Kensington Market. Kensington Market is like a kind of a, I don't even know if it's still there. It may very well not be, but you used to be able to get exactly the kind of clothes that she wears. You would get them in Kensington Market. So the fact that she goes shopping there is bang on. Boy says, yeah, it's nice here. Dane is sitting next to Lord Fanny, who's kind of like, there's a nice little bit of body language here where Fanny's tilting her head. She's a bit like, I'm prepared to be patient, but this pissed up little Scouser being homophobic is horrible. And indeed he sort of is. Dane is proper drunk, you could tell, because he's got these brilliant bubbles around his head. Lovely bit of comic book storytelling there, and kind of just like, yeah, when somebody's got bubble, when you're drunk, you have bubbles around your head, especially if you're drunk on fizzy wine. He's still talking about the Invisibles, how you know each other, how you recognise your fellow Invisibles, how you recognise the baddies. The blank badge, we are kind of told by Boy here, is an actual like official, as official as anything gets with the Invisibles, is like a kind of a marker, a recognizer for them. Remember how we said way back for like issue 2 that John Lennon kind of used to wear a black badge in kind of counterculture circles. Boy talks about, yes, so she says, yeah, you can wear a black badge, that way people might know you're an Invisible. She says, she mentions a guy called Jim Crow and says that there's another Invisible cell that's run by a guy called Jim Crow in Haiti. And we'll get into that later as well. King Mob knows a whole bunch of people. Of course, as we've established, he knows Agus and this somewhat tragic war survivor woman. They say, the whole point of having a terrorist cell is that you don't know too many other people, so you can't betray anybody if you get caught. Who are the baddies, asks Jack, and Fanny says, the baddies are called Myrmidons. And did we hear the word Myrmidon before? I don't know if we did, maybe not. I think this could be the first time we hear the word Myrmidon in relation to the baddies on the other side in the Invisibles. Myrmidons, again, we're going back to like the Iliad, where I remember what it's called this time. Achilles has got Myrmidons, right? Myrmidons means men who are ants, and it basically refers to like soldiers, like an army of soldiers who are kind of like all identical and do what they're told. And you can have, but obviously they're scary. Ants are scary individually, but they're small. And then when they're an army, they're scary and they're big. Fat old Mr. Gelt at the Harmony House was a Myrmidon. I'm sure you knew that even then. We kind of did know that, didn't we? Yeah. Jack's big, boorish and homophobic towards Fanny. And Fanny is bearing it with a huge amount of grace. She's saying, I love Jack. He's so direct. And then that's kind of it. It's just a nice scene, just nice bonding. You're picking up information, but you're also picking up, the storytelling's really nice. There you can, like, the food is being served and the dialogue's flowing well around the pages. And then who walks in? Kind of in shadow. Shadows. It's good, right? Because this colour scheme isn't like, this comic isn't coloured and drawn in like a chiaroscuro, but we're getting lots of shadows, like here in page 1 on panel 17, which is mirrored a bit down at the bottom of page 17, the final panel. This isn't like a shadowy comic. It's not like being all goth and black and white, but it's using shadows as a motif, and it's throwing them in delicately in such a way that you can't really see it. It kind of stays a bit invisible unless you've actually gone looking for it. So, like, really, I think the effect would kind of be, if I could only actually be 16 again. I don't think I probably would have noticed. I don't think a fresh reader would necessarily notice that they were being bombarded with so many shadows in this issue when it's clearly a theme. But in fact, you are. So in walks King Mob, and over the page we got a full boo 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 King Mob. It's great. Again, like Jill Thompson doing brilliant stuff. He just like when he walks in, he's so cool that literally you get little lightning flashes and exclamation marks and stars going off, and he's got these cool little like two-tone like flag stuff things happening behind him just to sort of frame him and make him look better. And he walks in and he's got his Craig Morrison, not Grant Morrison, no relation, rave jacket on. He's got this horrible like slightly fetishy, it might even be made of rubber, it might actually be worse than you think, with these like it's probably like I should have looked this up actually, but it's probably not Galliano, what's the word I'm looking for? Hello my British charms, who's that guy? Gautier, yeah? Or even the dead one, McQueen, sorry, that he's wearing. Yeah, like they're horrible. Those like little gold things on his nipples. But he looks really cool. I think, you know, oh okay, yeah, so we sort of mentioned this earlier, didn't we? But like there's an extra bit of detail on Ragged Robin's face here. Back on the previous spread on page 16. And that's because it is noticeable. None of the other characters get that level of detail on the drawing. That's because Ragged Robin, kind of physically, is based on Jill Thompson, right? That's so she's drawing herself here, and that's why she's given herself such a jaunty hat and an extra little bit of texture on her face. And this is apparently how she rolled at the time. This was kind of her style, and yeah, she looks great. She's got a very strong look, as we would say. Similarly, which has had an extra level of care and attention and detail put into the drawing, not to mention an extra layer of pizzazz, is King Mob's obviously based on Grant Morrison himself, looks-wise and kind of attitudinally. I think Morrison does slightly less mass murder, but, you know, watch this space. So this kind of like intro, this big kind of pizzazz guitar solo walk-in but reveal scene, he looks good and he's meant to, you know, and it works. It totally works in the context of the issue, in the context of the page. And after having seen him be a bit, you know, he's been well like gap year and like cultural appropriation-y throughout the rest of this issue, and he kind of walks in like this, and it's just like ba-da-ba-ba, with a great fanfare, a visual fanfare. Takes his shades off, takes his jacket off, sits down, and you're like, actually, I like this guy. You know, he's cool. Actually, we haven't seen it yet, but we like him. First thing he says as he walks in is very Byronic in our current context. He says, "Christ," he doesn't talk like that. Christ, did it have to be Indonesian? He's got a Cockney voice, but not Cockney, like a South London voice. Christ, it have to be Indonesian. Fish and chips would have done for me. Because obviously he's just come from Indonesia, so he's been eating Indonesian food for the past few days. There weren't many Indonesian restaurants at the time in London, I would say. Obviously there was plenty, but Indonesian was quite next level. It's quite aspirational eating, that really. Obviously Indians and Chinese restaurants would have been all over the place, but Indonesian, that would still be fairly rare back in older 95. Jack. But again, there's quite an affectation, right? To be like, there's all this Ponzi nonsense, all this foreign food. I like fish and chips because I'm a geezer. That's kind of this dynamic that we've been exploring throughout this issue and the past couple of issues, kind of popping up in his dialogue very clearly there. Another great picture here of Jack with his hair all floppy and his face all kind of like charmingly crinkly junk. Again, even though he's being a homophobic little brat, and a drunken one at that, he's being, you know, I'm not saying he's likable, but it is likable having him in the like. It's not like it's entertaining in the issue. They've got all these Rococo screens again. Robin has got flowers in her hat, and we think that flowers are stars now. So she's got a head full of stars. And King Mob's like, yeah, we've got a mission, guys. Come on, we're going to go and... Well, orders have come through. One of our agents is being relocated on the space-time supersphere. So we don't know. So what? So people are giving orders? I thought the whole point of this was that no, you guys didn't take orders. And what the hell is the space-time supersphere? And Jack doesn't even notice how ridiculous this is. He's just too drunk. We've got the job of bringing him out. And boy, he says, "Oh, I hate this time travel shit." And it's like, what? They're going to do time travel? This is cool because, you know, it does convince you that it's just a bunch of hipsters sitting around. We didn't even have hipsters back then. It's just a bunch of cool people sitting around having dinner. And yet, no. He can teleport through weird desert dimensions, and they do time travel. And it's like, oh, that's cool. That's really cool. Right after the coffee, we're going to go and get it. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get out of the country, because the thing is, there's a bit of a problem. Dig this. I found it in our Good Street mail drops. Yeah, so he's probably stopped off at Good Street on the way here. I get the feeling that they are in, you know, it's an Indonesian restaurant. It's the summer of '95. You can't quite read the name of the building opposite the restaurant. I'm saying West End. I'm saying west of Central. Yeah? Central / west of Central. And he's been via Good Street, which is Good Street. What's on Good Street? Like Good Street is Bloomsbury. Good Street is like very central London, but like kind of like not swanky, but quite kind of and not like old either, but like it's Bloomsbury. It's like the Bloomsbury. It's like the Bloomsbury set. It's like do I mean that? Or am I getting it confused? No, I think I mean that. University of London, British Museum. I should have looked this up. What an idiot. I think I'm right about that. It doesn't matter. Complain if I'm not. I need, motivation to be better at this research lark. There's a lot to research in this. I probably shouldn't be getting hung up on, details of London geography again. Horrible place. I found it on our Good Street mail drop. Et in Arcadia Ego and in Arcadia I ... It's signed Shipatotek. Orlando. It's Orlando. He's here in London. We're in deep shit. Now this. Okay, so a lot of stuff is tying up here, but it's only tying up in a kind of like there's even more questions kind of way. So Byron and Shelley were talking about Monsieur Poussin's famous painting, Les Bergères d'Arcadie, Les Bergères d'Arcadie, the Shepherds of Arcadia, and this is it. This is that picture. Orlando has sent them this picture. Now we're still not going to talk about this picture properly yet. What we are going to say is that there are two famous versions. There's like 1627 and then like 1636 or something. I think I might have even written that one down. But Poussin drew two versions of this same theme. This Et in Arcadia Ego theme is like a thing in Renaissance art. It's about kind of it's about loads of things. One of the things it's about is like it's a kind of a memento mori given like a kind of a mystical philosophical kind of charge. So memento mori in the sense of like after the Black Death kind of decimated Europe in the 14th century, and it was worse than decimated. It kind of halved the population. It completely changed everything. It's impossible to think of what the kind of the scale of the devastation would be now. Imagine it's like Thanos, right? Snapping his fingers. Half of everybody is dead within the space of a few years, and it changed society and led to this enormous obsession with death. Because everybody was like, and these are people who didn't have great life expectancies anyway, right? But suddenly half of everyone is just gone. And so skulls and stuff start to become, and Grim Reaper figures become these very important motifs in like European culture, European society. So this Et in Arcadia thing was a theme that lots of artists would tackle. I don't know when we're going to get to this. I am going to make a point of going into it quite deep because it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's kind of conspiratorially fascinating in like a 20th century secret society way, but in a kind of a broader like art history way, it's even more fascinating. But Monsieur Poussin, Nick Poussin, he was French, but he was a French person, but really he was an Italian artist. He spent most of his professional life in Rome, and he learnt to draw from Romans. And he learned to draw like Romans, and he learned to draw for Romans, or Italians, and so although he's French, he was an Italian painter really, and this is like so he drew two very famous versions of this painting of the Shepherds of Arcadia. This one here is Jill Thompson's nice but quick rendering of the first one, which was itself nicer but quicker. This is the so there are two versions. So this is the demo version, right? This is like the one that he did when he was younger, a bit more baroque, a bit more like I'm kind of a bit looser. It's like the lo-fi version, and then later on, several years later, he did like a super produced, very slick version. Now this is kind of the more fun version in a way, and it's kind of the one which allows you into its secrets a bit easier, because this is the one where, so what we've got here, as Byron was telling us earlier, we've got 4 shepherds in Arcadia. Arcadia was like an area of Greece which kind of was like, it was like the country, it was like Bumpkin Town, right? And people would be moving into the major Greek cities, kind of some of the earlier cities in Europe, and they were like, oh, urban life is tough. You probably know. Chances are you live in a city. It can be a pain. The pressures, the noise, and the smells, and the kind of the oppressive pace of urban living was something that people had to deal with back then as well. Back in Greek times, so 3,000 years ago, whatever, between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. They would mock the bumpkins of Arcadia for being slow and behind the times, because they lived in the countryside, not in the city, but also with no small measure of envy, because they built for themselves this idea that life in the countryside in Arcadia was brilliant and was kind of like not necessarily like heaven, because you didn't have to die to be there, but like an idyll, like a pastoral idyll. Words like pastoral and idyll come from the conceptions that were built around Arcadia, sort of. Don't quote me on that, but you know what I mean. So we've got 4 guys. They live in paradise. Basically, paradise is a better word for it than heaven. They live in paradise. They find a tomb, and the tomb says, "Even here in paradise, I'm still here." So death still lingers no matter where you are, right? Even though you're in kind of apparently a paradisical enclave, or at least that's the spin that Byron gave it earlier on in the issue. We're not going to disagree with him just yet. So this is the one where the shepherds have just been shagging blatantly. The woman's got no clothes on. The guy on the ground has got no clothes on, and literally hasn't stood up yet. These guys were literally having a good time, and then either they've noticed this coffin right there and broke off, or it's the end and they're kind of looking around and they've noticed this coffin. It's an old coffin. It's got these big trees near to it. So even back then it was still old. So you've got that kind of contrast of sex and death, right? And you've got this, and Thompson doesn't make too big a deal of it, but this guy's in shadow. This guy who's poking at the coffin is covered in shadow, and that's important. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of like codes and clues that are all kind of locked up into this picture, and they relate to Renaissance art history, sort of French art history, sort of like pre-modern European culture, in ways which frankly I don't understand fully, frankly nobody understands fully, and frankly might be kind of important about like where our culture comes from, who it's for, and why we have it. I think we're going to get to that later. I'm pretty sure. I haven't read ahead. I'm reading these issues one at a time. I'm not skipping ahead, so I'm relying on my memories of some of which are 25 years old to tell me that there's more Bergère d'Arcadie in a couple of issues' time, and we'll go further into what the painting means then. But we've got that's a creepy motif to pop up here, right? Because obviously, since we know that Orlando is the one who sent it to them, so it's like a threat. He's like, "I'm coming for you. This is my calling card." It's psychological warfare. He doesn't know exactly where they are, but he knows how to freak them out. And in fact, if he knows where their mail drop is, we know that Orlando can do a bit of space-time magic, so he may have magicked it to King Mob's mail drop, or he might be watching the mail drop, and then he's seen King Mob go there, and now he's following him. So there's kind of like the Invisibles does this a lot. Like good fiction generally does this a lot, right? There's an easy magic explanation for everything that somebody does, but there's also an easy, this is just normal explanation for something that everything does, something that everyone does, everything someone does. But yeah, so this is like the rude et in Arcadia ego, Berger d'Arcadie. It's also the one which is kind of a bit rougher and a bit more raw and a bit closer, maybe, to the nub of what this secret that's encoded in this picture is about. Yeah, we'll get to like the kind of the glossy hi-fi version of this picture later. Orlando, it's Orlando. He's here in London. We're in deep shit. And then this is nice silent panel, nice pause. And then Fanny breaks the silence with, "You certainly know how to kill a conversation stone dead, darling." Quick, this is a nice quick filler panel. The girls are in the car. This is like a flash Lambo, and they're driving. They're driving on their mission now. They finished dinner. They've had their coffee. They're driving out in the countryside. It looks like this is a very neatly trimmed and high hedge. These are little stones, probably very old stones. And yeah, this is a Lambo, which I think, I'm not going to check it now, or am I? No, I'm not going to check it now. But I think this car, it's King Mob's car, even though Fanny's driving it. And she's got shades on, and it's nighttime now. And it's like, I don't believe that she can see where she's going. The shades do look nice. And these guys are obviously not too fussed about it. But I would want her to not be wearing sunglasses while she's driving there. She's got the window open as well. The body language and the kind of the relaxedness of this whole panel is really good. I think this car might. This is what I was trying to say before I was so rudely interrupted myself. This car might be in the background, maybe on Tower Bridge. I think, if I remember correctly, when Tom and Dane are doing their thing in London. No, you remember how like the Invisibles are popping up in the background to kind of keep an eye on them? I think this car might be drawn in at some point, as if to say King Mob was watching them from his car. Okay, detail. So who's Orlando? Who's Orlando? Why is everybody shitting themselves? He's an assassin, Jack, one of the fleshless. He works for the other side. The fleshless Jesus, and he's after us. Fucking hell, what we doing here? I hope you got guns in this windmill. It's not a windmill. It only looks like a windmill. Yeah, right. So what is it then? What do you think? It's a time machine. So they're heading. This is all. This has kind of come out of nowhere a little bit. We knew they were doing something with the space-time supersphere, but there's obviously that nods towards time travel. In fact, time travel. This thing that I'm holding is a time machine, as we're sort of establishing, I think. But this is another thing which doesn't look like a time machine. It looks like something else. It looks like a windmill. Paintings are time machines. Cars are time machines. Guns are time machines. Grain is a time machine. Windmills are time machines. I asked my boys why they thought this was why this was what Morrison chose to make the time machine look like. There's either some like Moorcock novel somewhere, a little short story about time travel where the time machine is a windmill, or there's some like ancient forgotten kids TV show where a time machine was a windmill or something. It's such a singular choice that grateful to Adam for this. He was like, well, like the spinning windmill is like clock hands turning backwards or something. So maybe that's why it's a time machine. Also, it's a bit like Superman turning the planet back. Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, so I don't know if you know why the time machine is in the shape of a windmill. Let me know, because I don't really know. But there's probably some little obscure kind of reference there. Oh no, and it happens every issue. We're beginning to dread it a little bit. This is over the page, after page 20, is the obligatory ad break for the Sandman. I don't think this is even just the normal Sandman. I know it's the deluxe hardcover edition of World's End. That's the one where there's like a reality quake and everyone's sat in the kind of the oldie Tudor pub swapping stories while the storm rages outside kind of thing. It's all right, I suppose. This is such a generic Dave McKean advert, though. I think this is probably the cover of the Deluxe hardcover. And honestly, it's so cliched. It's all just like amber and things you can't quite see and insects. The only thing you can see is an insect trapped in amber, which kind of connects us to Jurassic Park, where we were before. Hello, sir. Hello, dear reader of The Invisibles. Welcome to 1995. Would you like a couple of horror anthologies? Would you like a statue of the Velociraptor? Or would you like a Sandman Deluxe hardcover? Well, I think I'm going to spend my money on drugs. Thanks very much. I guess in the company of people we... okay. All right, so this is the quote from Stephen King. That is from the introduction of the Sandman World's End Deluxe hardcover. Do you remember when comic collections used to have introductions? I told my daughter about that, and she was like, so? And I've given her comics to read which have got introductions in them, and she just gets past them because she doesn't need to fill the time in quite the same way. She's got other stuff to do. We didn't back then. I'm old. These are great. Can I do a good Stephen King impression? These are great stories, and we're all lucky to have them. To read now and maybe again. Then later on, when we need what only a good story has the power to do. To take us away to worlds, he doesn't talk like that, to worlds that never existed, in the company of people we wish we were, or thank God we aren't. Stephen King from his introduction. I mean, it's just filler, mate. It's just pablum. Maybe the stories are pretty good. Like all game and stuff. If you can kind of steel yourself to get through it, you will find something good in there. Anyway, over the page 21. Okay, so our guys are sat in a circle stroke slightly pentagrammatical formation. They've got the candles lit. They just said the banishings are all done, so they've been doing banishing rituals, which is rituals that you kind of do before you do your main ritual to sort of set the scene and prep yourself. Everybody join hands. More homophobia from Jack. I'm not fucking holding hands with him. It's not my hand, sweetheart. It's a satin evening glove from Harrods. Incredibly graceful, incredibly patient. We are learning, it's impossible not to like Fanny at this point, really, because good for her for putting up with this asshole. And then fair play to King Mob. Stop acting like a fucking moron, Jack, and just do it. And he's like, and it's like, good. Like, King Mob properly calls Jack out for his homophobia, and we've been getting sick of his homophobia. King Mob's been getting sick of his homophobia, and, the way that King Mob kind of like rolled in with his gang earlier made us go, maybe he's all right. Now, we're definitely thinking he's all right. He's like, well, we quite like this guy. Okay, and then King Mob explains how the thing they're going to do, this time travel ritual, which is what they're doing, works. This maybe doesn't help. The way this works, Jack, is that we fold psychic constructs of ourselves through from one point on the supersphere to another. All you need is the post-hypnotic trigger, okay? Hold the shadow wall, Jack. Feel the shadow wall. So this, I think, ties... So, like, shadow wall... Can you... Okay, hold the shadow wall, Jack. Feel the shadow wall. Can you see the graffiti on the wall, Jack? Black wall, glowing, neon graffiti, luminous letters. So this is filling in a gap from back in issue 2, when Tom and Dane are smoking the blue mold in the abandoned underground station, and Jack gets abducted by the alien guys, right? One of the things they did, and remember, they did literally plant something in his head. They planted this post-hypnotic trigger. So what we've got now is that the word Barbalith, written in that kind of semi-wet ink on the wall of the tube station, is now in Dane's head, Jack's head, as a post-hypnotic trigger that he can use to kind of go through and access his own psychic powers, which as we've established from Boy earlier, Jack's got latent psychic power, or a mean psychic gift, were her words, I think. And he can get into them through this post-hypnotic trigger. Maybe all of these guys have got exactly the same post-hypnotic trigger. Maybe they all went through exactly the same initiation process that Dane did. Maybe they've gone through slightly different ones and have got their own post-hypnotic induction triggers. But this is the thing, right? This is actually like a real thing. You can hypnotize yourself, or most kind of acts of psychodramatic magic will have some kind of like mnemonic where you like a visual mnemonic where you picture it, and it, through practice and time and establishing this thing as that, kicks you into the magic state of mind and allows the crazy shit to happen. The wheels on the windmill start turning, and not just turning but sparking in psychedelic colours. Shit gets really crazy really quickly. It starts spinning around in like a kind of a trans pride rainbow shape, colours. I mean, Jack's like, whoa, what's going on? Feel the shadow wall. They're all holding hands. Looks like they're spinning. From the motion of the candle, it looks like there's either wind, obviously it's a windmill, spinning within the chamber where they are in the windmill, or the chamber in the windmill is spinning. Think about like counter-rotating fields and what we think that means in conspiracy law sometimes. That's how UFOs work, isn't it? That's how flying saucers fly, is by two bits counter-rotating and creating electromagnetic magic that makes the flying saucer fly. Everyone knows that by now, surely. Okay, over the page, we've got another ad break. Quite a good one this time. Tainted by a film noir psychodrama of dark secrets and unbearable truths by Jamie Delano and Al Davidson. I haven't read this, but Jamie Delano's work can be a bit chewy sometimes. I don't know if he was being paid by the word, but sometimes his work can feel like he was, back then. George was such, and Al Davidson obviously can draw like a mofo. That's a great creepy picture. And we've got an insect again, like we had back on our deluxe hardcover advert, couple of ad breaks, in the previous ad break. You know how they do that sometimes, how like in the second half of the TV show, in the episode, the ad breaks seem to get a bit more frequent, don't they? So it is here. I haven't read Tainted. George was such a nice, quiet... This is the headline. George was such a nice, quiet man, his neighbours said. He wouldn't hurt a fly. I bet it does hurt a fly. But being normal is harder than it looks. So this is like he's got a plastic glove on. Again, in this post-Twin Peaks world of 1995, this plastic gloves mean serial killer. This is like, this is just pure Dharma. This is like, I don't mean, we're not talking about Hindu metaphysical concepts anymore. We're talking about Jeff. We're talking about the man with a fridge full of fun, whose story was was fresh and current at the time. What's probably going to happen is, and this will be really creepy, is that I'm going to actually do some research and then realise that Jeffrey Dahmer hadn't been arrested yet. Like the world didn't know about Dahmer yet, and that this is actually a very creepy coincidence that this guy kind of looks like him. In Tainted, which is what I assume is a serial killer comic, one-off special from Vertigo by Jamie Delano and Al Davidson. I'm gonna keep an eye out for it. It's about insects and hurting flies, and I've got a funny feeling that George may be a quiet man according to his neighbours, but could be harbouring a bit of a dark secret. What do you think? Okay. That's the end of the commercial break. We're back into the main storyline, and we're back into Venice of 1818. Back with Shelley Byron and the guy in the asylum. Now, I'm going to call him the maniac. This guy. Look at his poor face. Look at him. We're going to call him the maniac because that's what it's called in the poem. Where do you get in with this? It goes on forever. Okay, what's he saying? He's talking about light and dark. Can it be the same hand which plays both white notes and black? My skill is gone. Black wars with white, keys like chessmen. I would play for you, but my arms are burdened so with these chains. They have fashioned a most cunning torment for me. He's literally got the mind-forged manacles of Blake about him, holding him to his piano, he believes. Also, the thing about him playing a piano with black and white, or kind of like light and shadow, playing around and being, played or manipulated or puppeteered by one man, takes us right back to the Lang and the Wei Yang performance on page 1 of this here great little comic. But there's a strand here, and it's quite a tenuous strand, and you might not believe me, but I think when I found it, I was like, oh wow, that opened up a perspective for me, which I felt was quite important. So, in the poem Julian and Madelot, Byron and Shelley. Sorry, I've got that wrong one. Shelley and Byron. Shelley is Julian. Madelot is Shelley is Julian. Byron is Madelot. They go and meet the maniac, and they kind of think that he's going to give them some kind of insight into the debate that they're having. And like the maniac is like the star turn in the poem, really. What you get is Shelley doing just really sublimely beautiful language for its own sake that kind of gets so sort of intricate and rhythmically, kind of passionately rich and kind of and lyrical that you get totally swept away in it. It's just absolutely beautiful, and you don't really, even though and this is just what the maniac is saying about the reason that he's mad. He seems to be burdened with, like, madness, sadness, kind of like the classic symptoms of mania sort of thing, manic depression, as we would call it, bipolarity, and the words flowing out of him are just divinely beautiful. It's like it's such good writing, and you really kind of go, oh, as it's happening. But you're none the wiser at the end. He's just talking about how sad he is. Basically, what you can glean is that he found the woman of his dreams, probably through some fault of his own. Although he does appear to be prone to mental illness, so it's not really through any fault of his own. The relationship didn't work. He's lost her, and it's kind of broken him. Critics of the poem say that, like, the maniac is clearly based on Shelley. At this point in 1818, Shelley's relationship with Mary Shelley was on the rocks a bit, and this is him kind of going, oh no, I've messed up this relationship and I love her so much. I'm just going to pour this confused and heartbroken grief and loss out and put it into this figure of the maniac. But that's not really the interesting bit. The interesting bit, and the bit that's kind of relevant to us as readers of this comic, is that at the time, is that the other model for the maniac that Shelley used, it wasn't just about him and his relationship. The other model was this guy called Torquato Tasso. I've enjoyed saying that to myself so much, you have no idea. Torquato Tasso. Famous, don't get this wrong, you muppets. Look at your notes. Famous 16th century Italian poet from Verona, not far from Venice. Verona is like a bit inland, near Venice. Venice was basically the most powerful city in the world at this time, in Tasso's time, not in Shelley and Byron's time, although it was still doing pretty good. But Venice is covered in water, not many farms there. Verona would sell them. Verona's in the countryside, and would, there was a good, obvious, like, trading links with them. They were kind of allied cities. So it kind of makes sense that and although Tasso didn't go to the Venice asylum, he went to the Veronese one. Tasso went crazy, but he was one of Shelley's favourite poets. Certainly at the time, Shelley was going through his kind of Tasso phase, and so he put him into the text of Julian and Madelot, and he didn't just kind of put him into it, but he gave him the most important role in many ways, although not the hidden most important role. We'll get to her in the next episode or two, I think, when we look at the children of the Romantics. Tasso kind of resolves the entire... It doesn't resolve because, as we've established, it isn't really an argument, but it kind of... Tasso kind of resolves dialectically. Shelley had definitely read his Hegel. The opposition between Julian and Madeleine. Yeah? So what we get with the... So what happens is they go to the... see the maniac like they do in this page here. They listen to what he has to say. What he has to say is incredibly beautiful and eloquent, but it doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't resolve their argument whatsoever. And yet it does. Yeah, they forget their argument almost, and they spend the rest of the day, and I think the next day as well, kind of just talking about him, like reflecting upon the way that they've been moved in a real way by the maniac, like beyond the kind of the theoretical flattery of their own argument. They're actually looking at it for what it means when it kind of happens in the real world, right? So the figure of the maniac, his kind of madness, sadness, he's what happens when Shelley's ambition to be to love and for love to be the guiding principle of the universe, kind of for its own sake, is realised and comes kind of crashing into the reality of Byron's kind of like scepticism or cynicism. On the other hand, the whole point of the fact that it has happened and is real shows that Byron's kind of insistence that the world can only ever be a bunch of random stuff is false, right? So even though like the fact that the maniac has kind of loved and lost in that, and that's broken him, proves both of them right. But more than proving them right, it actually gives them like a frame or a thing to kind of put their argument onto, and makes them kind of forget the theoretical implications of it and just kind of be like, wow, this is what actually happens. This is what life is like when you do two things: when you have your objective desire, realize it, and then have to deal with the implications of it. Like the fact that you can find your heart's desire, love it or her, you know, like obviously the whole point, not the whole point, but like the way that romantic poetry kind of expressed itself was by saying that the object of desire was like a lover, a woman usually, you know, if it was a guy writing the poem. Even guys who weren't necessarily straight, because I've just found a cobweb. Even if those guys weren't necessarily straight, they kind of still had to sort of look as if they were straight in their poetry, right? Sorry, we've got a bit of camera wobble here. So the maniac plays this incredibly important role within the text of Julian and Madeleine. It's the point where the different poles of the poem and its argument resolve, and the utopia of Shelley and the dystopia, or the kind of the flat world, the kind of the world as it is, made of bricks and pain, that Byron wants to believe in, they both crash into each other at the point of the asylum, which is equally built out of fancy and reality. Yeah, so Tasso, in the form of the maniac, plays this incredibly important role. But there's more to that. There's more to Tasso than that, right? This is a very sort of oblique chain, very sort of subtle, that the Invisibles here has kind of set up. He does this other thing. So shortly before Tasso died, okay, so Tasso basically was like a courtier. A guy who spent his time kind of flitting around between the aristocracies of the major North Italian city-states, and kind of just like using his kind of his advanced social intelligence to smooth the wheels of society, to just kind of keep things going. He was a magician. That was what he obviously was. Whether he was called that at the time. He probably was. This was Renaissance Italy. In much the same way that King Mob and Lord Fanny and Ragged Robin are involved in the arts of strange thaumaturgy, so was Tasso in the context of his time. This is Renaissance Italy, and poetry, or in much the same way that comic books would become, and they weren't when the Invisibles was published, but they would become in the subsequent 20 odd years, are these major wellsprings of thought, right? Yeah, culture produces the type of world that people live in by giving them ideas. This is what Shelley was saying earlier, yeah? And giving them ideas to build the world out of. The world that Tasso used his incredible poetic talent to create was this one. His major work was called Jerusalem Libertad, right? Jerusalem Delivered. It's like a story about the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, and has this very kind of like neat narrative and kind of like, my goodness, isn't it strange how we haven't escaped from this narrative of the West versus the East, of the Christian versus the Muslim, right? And it's all about that. It's all set. Tasso had the excuse that like this, he wasn't generating that. He was looking back into history from where he was in the 15th century back to like the 12th century to get the meat for his poem. And it does get really weird, and I'm aware that what I'm saying is a little bit tenuous, but I think it's kind of real. Just before he died, he flitted in and out of asylums. He bounced between these different city-states in Italy because he was a genius and people loved him. He was handsome. But eventually his madness would kind of get the better of him, and he'd become difficult, and he'd kind of be forced on. He'd be forced to move on. So he was like the sensation of the town, and then the town would get sick of him. He wrote Jerusalem Delivered as like a kind of a gift for his patron of Verona, like his main patron, who was like the what's the word? Not Duke. Yeah, Duke basically. But there's a better word, isn't it? It's like major domo or whatever of but not that, of Verona. He wrote this massive poem for him, and it took him decades. It was the sensation of Europe immediately as soon as it was published in various kind of chunks, and influenced Renaissance society massively for ages thereafter. And you read it now, and like the first page is like it's like this kind of invocation of like, it's like angel magic, yeah. He's like invoking the thrones and the dominions and stuff right at the very start of his poem to give him the power, not just to get his poem written, but to get it out there and for it to have the kind of impact upon society that he kind of wants it to have, which is that his entire philosophy of like right ruling and of like the appropriate way for the heroes within this kind of society's narrative to behave. So heroes like him, the wonder workers, to have. This is what they were doing. Before he and he bounced around, and he was in this asylum for kind of like the last 12 years of his life, but then he was beginning to put things back together again, and the Pope, who loved his poetry, can't remember who the Pope was, but let's be honest, popes back then were not great guys. They were basically massive politico black magician types. Was gonna bless him using papal hand, and here we have this weird bit where the maniac, who is Tasso, let's remember, or at least kind of might as well be, creates this shadow on his hand with this kind of papal blessing sign. This is apparently because some pope or other had like a clawed hand, right? Like his these two fingers, his little finger and the ring finger on one of his hands on the right hand wouldn't work. So it became like a tradition that a pope would bless with two hands up, with two fingers up, three fingers down, because this guy had like a problem. Part of the point of this podcast is that we're dealing with the conspiracy theories that are attached to it, right? So you've got 2 points up and then you've got 3 points down. And you explain this by saying that, no, the Pope wasn't a Satanist. He was, he had like his hand wasn't quite right. He had like a weird sort of tendon thing in his wrist, which was pulling these 2 fingers down whenever he tried to just straighten his hand up, right? But really, you've got 2 up and 3 down. You've got an inverted pentagram. That's an obvious sign of Satan, yeah? This is like bad magic. And as you can see, this kind of act of Satanism actually creates a nice little silhouette of the Pope on the wall of the asylum behind Tasso, our maniac. One of the major characters of Jerusalem Delivered, Tasso's major work, is a chap called Rinaldo. He's like a medieval knight, kind of operating on like the French border of like Brittany and Spain, on that kind of like western side of France. All of this stuff, you can tell by the way that I'm talking about it without knowing what the hell I'm talking about, that it's not terribly familiar to me. This is basically to Western Europe what King Arthur is to Great Britain, right? We're talking about a Charlemagne, we're talking about Roland, gets into Joan of Arc territory. This is our vibe, yeah? Joan of Arc was obviously a lot later. But there's this kind of like, there's this matter of France. It's called, and in Britain, the Arthurian stuff is called the matter of Britain, because it's about how these cultures and these states, these nations are, through force kind of integrated and conquered and worked and politicoed their way out of the fact that they were just a bunch of, weird blokes with swords and castles. How do you form like the modern nation state out of that? And this is kind of the whole purpose of what Jerusalem Delivered is. It was written as like a kind of an understanding of what kinds of conflicts and how conflicts could be resolved to create like a new, better type of world. So we can see how that connects to what we've been talking about. There's the shadow thing because of the shadow on the wall of a satanic gesture, a satanic mudra, like hand symbol, casting something holy onto the wall behind it. In Jerusalem Delivered, there's a character called Rinaldo. Rinaldo is like the name of like one of these kind of like, he's like Sir Kai or someone, or like, a slightly kind of like mid-level Knight of the Round Table, but the Knight of the French Table. Rinaldo has a dad. He's called Rinaldo too. And when you're dealing within these kind of fictional or mythical or legendary lineages, whether one is one or whether one is one's dad, you've got the same name, you've got the same job, you've got the same personality, you're doing the same thing. Rinaldo is one of the major, or one of like the secondary major. He's like a Gawain or someone. He's not Lancelot or Arthur, but he's one of the next side characters that are playable. Rinaldo is in Jerusalem Liberated, the deliverance of Jerusalem. Nice, lots of lovely little ways that you can translate the title of the text, a bit like the ways you can translate Et in Arcadia Ego. And Rinaldo, but it was, whether it was him or his dad, doesn't matter, was a compatriot of the knight Roland, who is better known in Italian and weirdly in English as Orlando. Okay, so Tasso is part of this literary lineage. Tasso, the Armaniac here, is part of our literary lineage which created the figure of Orlando out of the nothing of historical fact. The real Roland, who would become Orlando, there's like one historical record of him. The Song of Roland, the kind of the famous folk poem that kind of tells us what the legend of Roland was. See how clearly this has a parallel with Tom O'Bedlam from our previous arc. It isn't based on any historical facts that we can establish about Roland, because there aren't any really. But But the legend as it kind of grew was that there was this knight who was not only badass, but he was monstrous. And through his kind of jealousy over his romantic relationships, went mad, and his madness kind of, it caused millions of deaths, right? So Roland, stroke Orlando, who is also somehow the Aztec god Xipe, is also Arjuna from the Mahabharata, and is also the creation because he's in a war, which is kind of like a war is using this person to carry itself out rather than it being about him, is also the part creation or not the part creation, but this guy was the sustainer of Orlando. We're trying to work out what the hell Orlando is, right? And what we're getting at here is that there's this figure embedded within European culture. And when I say figure, I mean like a golem or a servitor or a kind of a deliberately created mass of a tulpa, right? A mass of intent that somehow commits bloody violence in the sake of the preservation of the status quo. That's where we're going. You can even see this. Okay, so most guys, especially in the 90s, if you heard Orlando, you would think of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. We can think of this because we heard Good Street mentioned earlier, just a couple of pages ago when they were in the restaurant, right? Good Street is like the western border of Bloomsbury, which is famously where Virginia Woolf's entire kind of literary sort of being sprang from. Her most famous creation probably is her most famous novel, certainly her most fun to read work, is Orlando, a kind of a gender shifting immortal. Orlando in Woolf's novel changes gender in Constantinople, which is kind of like this border where East meets West, which, you know, and that border where East meets West, or where Christian meets Muslim, has happened at other points in history during, you know, Woolf's time when the Ottoman Empire was kind of fading and the British Empire was picking up. That was in Constantinople, Istanbul as we would call it now. At other points in history, that was kind of on the French southern Spanish border. And at other times that was in Jerusalem. And at times like today, you would find it, in Syria. 15 years ago, you would find it in Iraq, right? This is like, there's a big story here going on, and Orlando is knitted right into it as this giver of violence for this process. I'm aware that I may have lost a few of you with this, because I may be talking nonsense, but basically this guy here, the guy that Byron and Shelley go to meet, is in real life created, or not created, but sustained, spread the meme of this guy here, the serial killer scary guy who's currently on the hunt for King Mom's invisible cell, our heroes. I think there's more to say about this, and hopefully I'll have worked out a more eloquent way to say it before too long. But I think that is quite key to what's going on here. I think that's the invisible bit of this issue, is that the reason that the monster in this arc is called Orlando, remember we read him last issue too, is because this Orlando thing is some kind of symbolic actor that performs the necessary violence of the culture clash that the status quo of Western Europe, and obviously Western civilization uses to sustain itself. That violence, that colonial violence, that financial violence, that religious violence, that social violence, all coalesces into the form of Orlando, which dates back to this dead knight called Roland from the Breton Marsh 1,000 years ago. This Roland figure gets called up variously to work the bloody work of the forces who, as Boy describes them, the forces that want to control people's lives and keep us asleep forever. I think that could be what we've done here. I think that could be where we're going. I think that could be what we're all about. And all of the stuff that the maniac's actually doing in this scene is, you know, it has its own sort of like black and white, dark and shadow stuff as well. But I don't think that's as important as the stuff that you can find out about Tasso and his kind of his like function within European cultural history, and the ideas that he helped to, these big, living, dangerous ideas and ideals that he helped to create and spread, sustain. Like Krishna, the sustainer, yeah? Let me know in the comments. I think I may have gone a bit crazy. I've had one of those days today, to be honest. Ask me about it if you want. He says, and then Tasso, our maniac, says at the end, the Pope is the holiest of men. But really, is there a holier man than he who says the 23rd Psalm? Well, I think it's the 23rd Psalm. I don't really know my Bible. Just as he's about to have his head chopped off. And here we've got our dudes. This is the final page of the issue. Our dudes, our invisible cell. Suddenly here in what looks suspiciously like revolutionary France. Our guy here who's getting his head cut off says, "In pastures green he leadeth me, the quiet waters by." Sounds a little bit like what we saw Jack do, you know, pastures green, in the last issue. There is no death, dear God, deliver me from... Famous last words. King Mob doing his usual sort of glib gallows humour thing. Literally, guillotine humour. We're not going to talk about guillotines now, because I think this episode's gone on quite far enough and we've still got the letters page to go. I'm really sorry. But next episode, we find ourselves in revolutionary France. And a lot of these ideas that we've scratched upon in this really rather thought-provoking, and I hope you feel by now, wonderful issue, are going to start to get not resolved, no, not by a long way, but explored, teased out, furthered, preserved and sustained. There's a lot to find out, and we're going to have a good time with it. Thank you ever so much for joining me. We're not finished yet. I sound like I'm finished. Just the story's finished. We've actually got the letters page to go through. I'm going to be quick, though. I mean, honestly, you've been so patient, and you may not even still be here. So I do really appreciate it if you are. Grant Morrison. So we go on to the Invisible Ink page, letters page. We're well into the letters now. Morrison has his little preamble here. He says thank you to the previous art team. He welcomes the current art team. He, not unself-awaredly, bless him, says, I'm going to lose some readers here because the next 4 issues are going to be really difficult to read and aren't going to be as much fun as this kind of like 90s guys. And remember, the 90s didn't used to be retro in the 90s. It was just how things were. This kind of super fast modern guns and magic and cool guys going to raves comic that we were promised in issue 1. We're not getting that, and we're not getting it for another 4 issues, which is a long time in comic books. That's a season. That's a season in the sun. So and he acknowledges that straight up in this little preamble. He welcomes the art team. We're gonna just have a really quick look at the letters in this one, because there's like a whole podcast separately in the letters page to the Invisibles, because they're really good letters and they throw up a lot. This one is the best one in this issue, from Stephanie Grant of Deakin Hall, Monash University, Clayton 3. Oh no, I'm not going to read out the. She won't live there anymore because it's a university address. She was clearly a student at this point, and she won't live there anymore. But still, not good practice to read out the people's address, is it? Grant, and her whole letter is this. I'm going to read out the whole thing, and between all of the kind of the significant terms, there's no punctuation. There's just an asterisk. It's the 90s-ist thing ever. This person has definitely got email, even though she appears to have written a letter. But this person has got an email. She's got, she's been on, not Netflix, what's it called? Live Journal, not even Live Journal. What was the early one called? Something Group. I don't care. I don't think you care. Grant dear, Zeitgeist, asterisk, Yeomans, Yoels, Yodels, asterisk, Existentialist Little Thugs, asterisk, Wormhole Eyes, asterisk, Virgin Bombers, asterisk, Unplanned Umbilical Ties, asterisk, Time is fleeting, madness takes its toll. Oh, nice little Rocky Horror Show reference there. Quintessential Questions, asterisk, Psychedelic Pulchritude, asterisk, Overkill Liverpool, asterisk. I presume this is kind of aleatory. I presume that this is a little bit... She may have just been pulling words out of her hat here. I mean, let's hope so. No, brackets, yes, good, brackets, bad, asterisk. Male pattern baldness lobotomy. With your sister, got that, love it, asterisk. Hamburg Heaven, asterisk, Gowan. Dane McGowan, 00 nothing, asterisk. Father, the stew, and their holy toast. I like that one a lot. Asterisk. Eunuchs, asterisk. Driving the Astra L plane. Yeah, see? She got the star connection, so did I. I'm bright. Asterisk. Carpe Mundum, sees the world. Asterisk. Book burning, asterisk. All praise to 3, O Morrison, asterisk. And Morrison's reply is, Stephanie, dear, Antipodean airmail artistry, asterisk, secret star maps, asterisk, something, next. But that's a hardcore letter to send to a comic. That's a better letter than any other comic book up to this point had ever received. And I include the one that the Punisher fan sent to the Punisher in the 80s about wanting to go out and kill people. Not people, scumbags. The neighborhood drug dealers. That's the best comic book letters page letter of all time. But this one's a close second. Well done, Stephanie. You're a legend. Stephanie Grant, obviously, is the name of Steffi Grant, like the famous British occultist. It's a good name to have. Another letter from Jeff DeMose. He's from New York. I won't read it. Like Broome Street. He lived on Broome Street, number 13 Broome Street, 10013 Broome Street. Broome is like a surname of a famous comic book creator. All of these little synchronicities do tend to pile into each other when we get to the Invisibles letter page. His letter is about cities. He's kind of there's almost like a critique of like Morrison's kind of travelogues that we had in the first 3 issues before the letters page started. Remember them? And it's a shame because he kind of gives Grant a bit of a time to talk about it. He talks about modern cities seem at first, this is Morrison, modern cities seem at first to be disconnected from the numinous, as Young called it, that sense of awe and uncanny significance which objects possess in dreams and trips. People are hungry for sacredness, and one of the reasons we glamorize serial killers and are attracted to murder sites, for instance, is, I believe, because they actually empower and mythologize the secular landscape. I don't know, I think they did that before the secular landscape was a thing. I think that might be about a bit horse before the cart. The next letter is by a guy called Will Brooker, who I think posted on my blog covers. I don't know. He is a smart cookie because look at what he's done. I'm going to show you his address. His address is address withheld. Yeah. Why should you fill 2 lines of text on a letters page for DC with your personal data? It's good hygiene from Will Brooker here. He also writes a really sensible, cool letter as well. My favourite bit is this bit. Invisibles number 1, because we've been talking about this a lot. Invisibles number 1 was the comic equivalent of an Oasis album. A scally rock and roll trip fired with... The word trip pops up a lot, doesn't it? Fired with arrogance and ambition. Number 2 calls to mind entirely different cultural sources like Eliot's ghostly visions of London or Joyce's theory that Dublin, if ever destroyed, could be rebuilt using Ulysses as a guide. Or the 2 or 3 things Jean-Luc Godard knew about Paris. I think Will Brooker gets this. He knows what's going on here. And then he kind of writes a nice little kind of like review and like a well done and a keep it going kind of letter, which is a nice thing to do. Damon Cat in the following letter, and Morrison's reply to Will Brooker's letter is basically just to go, yep, because clearly this reader gets it and Morrison is giving him a nice little affirmation. That's good. The next letter is by a guy called Damon Cat from Rakeless in Hants, which is kind of like short guy. So basically Guildford. His postcode is GU33, which I think is probably Guildford, but like distant Guildford. He basically lives in the countryside in like southeast England near Guildford. It's the worst place in the world. It's the worst place in the world. Sorry, Damon. Your letter's quite boring too. It's another Pulp versus Oasis retread, telling Morrison off for being a bit pretentious or kind of being precious about being pretentious. You can't win. And Morrison's reply is a bit antagonistic as well. It's a bit like, oh God, who cares if I'm being a bit surreal or a bit not free chord guitar rock, which he is being as well. He's very, like, it's fair enough for Morrison to get annoyed by these boring critiques. Not that Damon's an idiot or anything. It's just that his opinion's wrong. It's just that his opinion's wrong. The final issue, the final letter in this issue is by a guy called Michael Sperlinger. He's from Lee, London SE12. He lives in South London. So we've got 3 letters from England here. I mean, Will Brooker's from England, even though he doesn't give his address away. The cultural references that he uses gives them away. And also the fact, I'm pretty sure, like, Will Brooker's like Dr. Batman, right? He's got a PhD in Batman studies or something ridiculous like that. And you can find him on the internet to this day very easily by Googling his name. And he's Dr. Batman, pretty much. And an Invisible superfan. So he's basically all right. So we've got 1 from Australia, 1 from New York City, and then 3 letters from England. So it's kind of clear where the fandom of the Invisibles is skewing, which isn't a great thing because there are very, very few places to buy the Invisibles in England at this time. So what you've got here is proof that there are a lot of very hardcore fans, but they're very hardcore fans. And so like they're all tightly packed into the nucleus of we really like this comic, and the kind of the broader generalized audience that you need to actually sell the comic and make the company money doesn't really exist. We don't know that yet, but as it turned out, it didn't really exist. On to Michael Sperlinger from Lee in South London. He writes a nice little letter. It's a good, it's just a kind of like a normal one. And when I say normal, that's not dismissive. These letters are well above par for any other comic book letters page. Like, the people who write into this are smart, funny, informed, and kind of, egotistical enough to be trying to tell the comic what it's about, which is what a good letters page needs, which is what a good fan should try and do. Even if it's 30 years later and you're a million years old and you've got better things to do with your evenings. This is going to look awful, isn't it? Love you. I had a weird day today. The best bit in Michael's letter, I'm going to read out this whole thing. By the way, Grant, speaking of heroes, I'm beginning to wonder if my own Morrissey fixation really is just a happy coincidence. Okay, so and then he kind of there's a bit. He talks about Grant Morrison being a bit like Morrissey, and they're both doing this kind of Britpop-esque reaction against American culture thing, which is kind of interesting, and it's terrible for Morrison to be being so closely associated with Morrissey, and Morrison loves it at the time. But that's a terrible thing in hindsight. Morrissey's turned into like the great disappointment of pop culture, basically. Turns out he didn't have like a kind of an interestingly eccentric take on what like oldie England could offer to the modern psyche. He was just backwards and racist. Oh, shocking. And Morrison kind of goes, yeah, I am a bit like Morrissey, which reads really bad in retrospect. And Morrison's reply is good. Strange that after this is Morrison. Strange that after so many years of me acting like Morrissey, he's now begun to act like me. Did you see the Select cover where he recreated Big Dave's knuckle duster pose from 2000 AD, 869? And then we get into real deep, weird, like comics arcana. But yeah, during the kind of at this point, so this is like a few months before this. So what, like in mid '94, Morrissey posed on the cover of Select magazine. We will meet Select magazine in 2 pages time, where they say the word indispensable. The editor of Select magazine. Okay. So you've got Morrissey kind of doing like knuckles, being all tough. Like Morrissey was never tough. Where did he get that from? Just because you fancy skinheads doesn't make you tough. With a big Union Jack behind him, and it's this interesting kind of cultural artifact now, because it kind of points the way to how bad the kind of the cultural reclamation of Britishness that Britpop kind of said it was about, of how bad that can go if the world is awful and everyone in it, or not everyone in it, but like prickishness abounds. This kind of like gleeful, slightly ironic, aggressive reclaiming of like far right racism culture can actually turn into far right racism culture. Bad scene. Morrissey. Anyway, and then but yeah, I don't know whether I should even talk about Big Dave now. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Big Dave now because the podcast has gone on for long enough. You all want to go home. I want to go home. If literally anybody in the world gets this far and wants me to say a thing about Big Dave, I will. But you have to put a comment saying, "Hey Bobsy, tell us about Big Dave," in the comment to this. I don't think it's worth it. Other than that, like, the Fergie and Di stuff at the time made me chuckle. I seem to remember. And maybe that will get relevant later on in the Invisibles, but I don't think so really. But it really feels like one of those little kind of like canary coal mine issue things, when we should have kind of recognised what's going on here. But yeah, anyway, so Morrison gives a reply that's about Morrissey, that's about Big Dave. He mentions Duncan Fegredo's work on a King Mob 6-pager for the next Vertigo rave thing, now called Absolute Vertigo, which I'm going to dig out from somewhere or find in a 50p bin somewhere soon, and I'll do a bonus issue about that 6-page King Mob strip, which is beautifully drawn because it's by Duncan Fegredo, and has probably got some interesting things to tell us about our current cultural moment in the way that it took certain deformations of like conservative psychology, conservative party, like English Conservative Party psychology, for granted. Like, there was a time in the 90s where we all knew that the Conservatives were like broken-minded demons, and that was fine, and that was fine because they weren't ever going to be in power again, and then look what happened. But yeah, I'll do a little. That's a short thing, and I'll do a little podcast about that as soon as I find it in a 50p bin somewhere. I'm not spending proper money on it, or you can send me your copy, because I'm not digging through my mum's loft to find 6 pages. Next issue bar. Okay, God, things. Okay, sorry. So that was brilliant. This was a really good issue. I got drunk between the, pages 22 and 23, as you probably noticed. This issue was really dense and brilliant, but the next 3, I don't think we've even started yet. I was hugely stunned by the fact that, without even realising it, I'd been to San Servolo, where a bit of this comic takes place in the time when I didn't care about the Invisibles, although the Invisibles still cared about me. I blew my mind with the fact that Tasso, the model for the maniac in Shelley's poem, was in part responsible for the propagation of Orlando as a theme. Orlando isn't in Tasso's work, but the narrative that Orlando comes from, like the Song of Orlando and then Orlando Furioso in Boiardo's epic. We might get to this when we do more Orlando stuff later. Slides through history, and Tasso is one of Tasso. What's Tasso? Tasso is one of the Orlando issues, big vectors. All of that blew my mind, and yet the next few issues are even better and bigger. And I'm going to make the podcast shorter though. I've got to. The next issue by here says, the Marquis de Sade makes a hospital visit and is invited to paddle in someone's entrails. The Invisibles complain about the smell of Paris. Then encounter the hideous cipher men, and Orlando goes to work on our heroes with his gardening secateurs. Plus, Mary Shelley takes a coach trip to Venice. There's a lot there, guys. There's a lot to cover. On the next page, we get this advert for like buy your Vertigo comics. And I'm not sure what the relevance here is, except that, like, remember how we said in an earlier episode that birds were magical? This is like a bird demon that can breathe fire. I don't know which comic it comes from. Not that fast. But big ass bird demons destroying cities and breathing fire. Bear it in mind. Think about how it relates to what we've seen before. Interesting on the Ledge page where Art Young talks about how him and a guy called Tim Pilcher, who's also about setting up a London office for Vertigo Comics, which seems fabulously extravagant and not a little bit ridiculous in hindsight, and I can't believe they did it. Good on him. Tim Pilcher, I'm pretty sure, actually wrote a book about this, and I haven't read it, but I'm going to read it. About this period, about this office, where you set up an office and you just invite Grant Morrison and Pete Milligan to come around and tell you what they think about Hellblazer and stuff. Sounds like a brilliant laugh, and everybody's drinking and going to raves and taking pills and stuff. Sounds brilliant. This is also the month where Kill Your Boyfriend came out, which we can see here. Kill Your Boyfriend is like an Invisibles adjacent text that Grant Morrison wrote at the same time. It was drawn by Philip Bond, who we will find in 100 years' time in a later Invisibles issue, in several later Invisibles issues. Kill Your Boyfriend is like it's like a hidden chapter of the Invisibles that was published kind of separately. Again, if you can be asked and want me to do a review of that, I will. Just pay me 69p and tell me that you want me to do it, and I will, right? The Invisibles entry in the kind of the Vertigo listings here is where I get the idea that this cover is de-hanced rather than enhanced. It hasn't got shiny reflective metal on it. It's just cardboard. It's just like rough paper. And then we get to the back page, the inside back page, where there's a review from Comics International. Comics International is defunct now, but used to be published out of Brighton, where I'm sitting now, which says, Morrison's vision is absolutely and typically different. Typically different. Nice little... It's either bad writing or it's a nice little rhetorical flourish. Let's go with the latter. Creating a marvellous new series, which on the evidence of the first two issues, really does live up to the hype. Agree. Hard agree. Well done, Comics International, guys. Then we have a quote from Time Out. And again, it's very interesting to note that this is a comic book being reviewed in Time Out, which is like the main cultural listings magazine for all of London. London being the only city big enough. London is obviously like a key city to our narrative here in the Invisibles, but it's also the only city in the UK which is kind of big enough to sustain a magazine like Time Out that's worth a damn. And they've covered the Invisibles. That just doesn't happen to comics. It kind of still doesn't happen to comics, probably, but it happened to the Invisibles because smart people knew that something cool was going on in the Invisibles. And their review says, should for once show that comics really are places where anything can happen. Time Out. And then we have this quote, Select magazine says it's indispensable. Select magazine was the kind of like, the 90s was like the kind of the great last hurrah of the British music press. And Select was like that last hurrah's idiot brother, basically. If you're interested in what Select magazine is doing now, it basically tours like shitty towns in Britain, asking racist pensioners whether they think Britain should be more racist, and they say yes. And this is meant to pass for political insight. These things, the Invisibles hasn't gone away. It's just that a big chunk of it turned into a prick and ruined Britain. And here we sit. What the fuck? Okay, I've got a feeling that the last 40 minutes may have been utterly unbearable for anybody with any brains, and I'm really sorry. I'm going to try and refocus things a little bit on the next episode of this. But, you can follow me on Twitter on @BobsyMindless. Please follow @Diane Podcast, and also listen to the Diane Podcast that we're putting out again. This is for Patreon subscribers only initially. So go to patreon.com/Diane Podcast and give me $1, which is, as I said a minute ago, only 69p or so. Exchange rates may vary. Do all of that. But the previous episodes of the Invisibles podcast are now going free on YouTube because it's been ages. It's been ages. And that's how it's going to go from now on. We do an arc. You have to pay to get the arc when it comes out, but then the last arc goes free. So that's going to happen very soon after this episode has gone online for our brilliant Patreon subscribers, who I feel like I'm almost being a bit insulting to by providing such a slapdash issue. And I am sorry about that, but we're gonna get better. Okay. Thanks ever so much for your time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you in a month's time where we look at Arcadia episode 2, where it gets much more sensible and easy. Yeah, it doesn't. All right, all the best. Lots of love. Cheers. Bye.